Chapter 727. At this time, there were a total of 1,296 continents in the untainted land. Even if the continent where Bujo Mountain was hidden in another space-time rhythm was excluded, there were still 1,295 continents. Text first. Every single one of these continents was nearly boundless. For the living beings in the untainted land, even if all of them gathered on a continent, they would only occupy a small area of the continent. Under such circumstances, the 9 continents near the center could be linked together to form the 9-continent continent. This was already due to the incredible means left before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Therefore, although there were many living beings in the untainted land at this time, there were no traces of intelligent living beings in most areas. The entire untainted land was still very primitive. The place where Luo Chunyang, Luo Gua, and Lao Dan landed was the continent closest to the northwest of the 9-continent continent, the Qing continent. At this moment, this was the continent where the moon was facing. It was also the continent closest to the moon in the untainted land. It was also the last place where Lao Dan landed before he headed to the starry sky. The reason why he chose to land here was that it was closest to the moon. The starry sky at this time seemed to be no different from the endless starry sky before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. When one looked up, the sky was still full of stars dotting the pitch-black void. However, in fact, there was an essential difference between the two. They had completely different characteristics. If it was the endless starry sky before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, one would appear at the same place in the endless starry sky after passing through the astral wind, thunder, and fire layers no matter where one started in the untainted land. The distance from any of the stars in the sky would not be different depending on the starting point. The reason was that the endless starry sky actually belonged to another space-time. Although it was attached to the untainted land, it also had some characteristics of another space-time. However, the starry sky at this moment was not like this at all. The relationship between the starry sky and the untainted land at this time was not the relationship between two space-times, but the relationship between the top and bottom. In other words, when one looked at the starry sky from the untainted land, the starry sky seen from different positions would be completely different. When they headed to the starry sky from different positions, the distance between them and the stars would also be different. The reason for this was not difficult to understand. After all, the primordial world was so vast and practically boundless. Compared to it, any star was only an extremely tiny dot in the primordial world. Under such circumstances, the stars that were spread out in the primordial world naturally could not occupy the main body. They could only become embellishments in the primordial world. The stars that were embellished in each area were obviously not exactly the same. Naturally, there would be a difference. Of course, the sun and the moon were the two most important stars in the starry sky. Their positions were fundamentally different from other stars. If the starry sky was complete, the positions of the sun and the moon had to be paid attention to. The different positions of the sun and the moon would not affect the distance between them as much as other stars. However, at this time, only 365 of the stars in the sky were complete. The other stars were only condensed from the essence of the stars. How could the stars in the sky be considered complete? Naturally, the positions of the sun and the moon could not accurately reach the positions that they had to stay at. Therefore, the difference between the positions of the moon and the untainted land between the 9-continent continents appeared. The reason why Luo Chunyang and the other two did not choose to fly directly in the northwest direction in the starry sky and land on the continent that had disappeared was because the distance between flying in the starry sky and walking in the untainted land was not too far apart. If they really flew in the starry sky, it would also take hundreds of thousands of years to reach the continent. Obviously, the boredom of flying in the starry sky was countless times better than walking in the untainted land. There was no need to think about how to choose. When they landed on the Qing province continent, they saw large areas of primordial forests, high mountains, plains, grasslands, and gobi. Although the area that they could see was full of vitality, there were not many traces of intelligent creatures. Only the roars of beasts and the wails of mourning could be heard by the three of them. Senior brother and senior sister. The Qing province continent is far away from the center of the 9 continents. Therefore, not many cultivators are active here. That's why it looks so primitive. Lao Dan said when he saw Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo's expressions. He knew that they were sighing with emotion. It's really very different from the past. Luo Chunyang sighed. I haven't been here before, but I remember that there used to be a large city ruins here. Our dynasty and the people of the Demon Clan often came here to exchange information. But now, I can't find any traces of it. Time has really changed. Luo Guo sighed with emotion, which was rare for her. Before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, this continent was an area close to the center of the untainted land. It was also the place where the main forces of the human race and the demon race came into contact. Therefore, this continent was the place where wars broke out the most frequently. At the same time, it was also the place where the human race and the demon race understood each other and exchanged information the most frequently. Although the battles between the human race and the demon race were the mainstream, no matter how deep the hatred was, it could not stop the drive of interests. Therefore, the two parties would definitely communicate and trade. The city ruins was created under this background. It was a city for the human race and the demon race to communicate and trade. Of course, the city ruins that originally existed here was not the only city ruins in the entire untainted land. It was also not the largest city ruins. However, it was a relatively special city after all. Therefore, it had left an impression in the memory of Princess Guo of the Daluo dynasty. After the great tribulation of heaven and earth, various terrains of the untainted land had changed. However, there were still traces of the original city ruins. As soon as Luo Guo arrived here, she naturally thought of the city ruins. Therefore, she sighed with emotion. When Lao Dan saw that Luo Guo was looking at a place that was tens of thousands of miles away in the south, he knew that the city ruins was probably there. He said, "Anyway, we're not in a hurry now. Why don't we go to the city ruins and see if there are any ruins left?" Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were naturally indifferent. They immediately nodded and agreed to Lao Dan's suggestion. Since they had reached a consensus, the three of them turned into long rainbows and flew toward the city ruins that was tens of thousands of miles away. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived at that location. If they did not know that there was a city ruins in this location before the Great Tribulation, they would just think that this location was a relatively flat plain. However, when they looked at this place again, they could see the traces of countless buildings left at this location. The terrain was faintly undulating, the depressions that faintly divided the plain into rather regular areas, and the regular distribution of various plants all indicated that there were traces of human activity in this place a long time ago. The three of them did not come here just to take a look at this place from afar. Therefore, they did not float in the void. Instead, they directly landed at the center of the city ruins, which was originally the core of the entire city ruins. It's a pity. Although there are some traces left, it has been greatly deformed, Luo Chunyang sighed. Yes, it seems to have been expanded by 10 times. There are faults everywhere. If we don't look for it by force, I'm afraid we won't be able to find it. Luo Guo also sighed. The changes in the untainted land were not just the fact that a piece of land was divided into 1,296 continents. It was also magnified by 10 times. Under such circumstances, the terrain of each area was naturally magnified by 10 times. However, it was impossible for the man-made buildings to be magnified by 10 times. Therefore, there were faults everywhere in the city ruins, and it was impossible to restore them. So it has been magnified by 10 times. I thought that the city ruins would be so huge. I was almost shocked. Lao Dan could not help but laugh when he heard that. This was not a lie. The city ruins occupied an area of tens of thousands of miles. The area of such a city was almost unimaginably huge to Lao Dan. Compared to it, the cities that existed in the untainted land that were hundreds of miles or even thousands of miles were just like small villages. How could he not be amazed? When he heard that the city ruins had been magnified by 10 times, he finally let out a sigh of relief. Although a city of thousands of miles was still dozens of times larger than the cities that existed in the untainted land at this time, it was much better than the previous city of tens of thousands of miles. This is just a small city that was built temporarily for the purpose of trading. Although it was left behind because of the changes in the situation, it was almost a city in the past. The cities that we built back then were 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, and even 10,000 times bigger than this. If you're already shocked by this, won't you be paralyzed when you see other ruins? Luogwa laughed. After all, she was not a weak woman who would grieve over the coming of spring. After sighing with emotion, her mood had returned to normal. According to the legend, there was an extremely prosperous civilization before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, only a few words were passed down. The truth is not known. It seems that senior brother and senior sister are very familiar with that period of history. I wonder if you can tell me about it, Lao Dan said with a smile. So you don't know? Luogwa was surprised when she heard that. It's only been 1 or 2 yuanwei. Many cultivators survived the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Why don't you know anything about that period of history? Luo Chunyang was also quite puzzled. Lao Dan could not help but smile bitterly when he heard that. He said, senior brother and senior sister. Although there were many seniors who went through the Great Tribulation, they regarded that period of history as a taboo. It's fine to ask them for questions or to ask them for Dharma spells. However, if you want to ask about that period of history, you'll never get an answer. Although there are some words about that period of history in the untainted land now, it's only spread by those seniors who accidentally let it slip. How can anyone understand the real history? I see. Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua were suddenly enlightened. They looked at each other and saw the look in each other's eyes. They did not know whether to laugh or cry. Finally, Luo Chunyang sighed and said, it seems that when they saw the scene in the untainted land now, they thought that the untainted land was destroyed. Feeling guilty, they were unwilling to pass down that period of history and continue the hatred in the past. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were only juniors under Luo Fan. However, they were still powerful beings in the golden immortal realm. Even before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, they were still the most powerful beings in the untainted land. They were invincible in the untainted land at this time. With such divine power, how could they be ordinary? Although Lao Dan only said a few words, they had a complete understanding of the mentality of the living beings who survived the Great Tribulation based on the situation in the past and the scene in the untainted land now. They knew why they regarded that period of history as a taboo. When Lao Dan heard Luo Chunyang's words and looked at their expressions, he could not help but be shocked and said, could it be that the untainted land has already been destroyed? From what senior brother said, could it be that there's something mysterious about this? Junior brother Lao Dan, do you also think that the untainted land has been destroyed? Luo Guo laughed. Is that not the case? Judging from the places in the trial grounds, the cultivation environment in the untainted land is tens of thousands of times worse than before. The sky is gloomy, the earth is broken, and even the heavenly pillar seems to have been broken. Isn't it destroyed? Lao Dan said in surprise. Lao Dan looked like an old man, but in terms of age and cultivation, he was far inferior to Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua. He was also far less knowledgeable than them. Therefore, he put himself in a very low position and did not feel embarrassed to ask them for advice. Junior brother Lao Dan, you've really misunderstood. What you've said is not a sign that the untainted land has been destroyed. The cultivation environment in the untainted land is worse than before. That's because the chi of heaven and earth has evolved from the original innate chi to the acquired chi of heaven and earth. It's a process from instability to stability. Although it's more difficult to cultivate, it's the growth of the untainted land, Luo Chunyang said with a smile. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were the grandchildren of Luo Fan. Their innate foundation was extremely strong. Therefore, their knowledge was naturally not comparable to that of ordinary cultivators. They might not be able to fully grasp the essence of the evolution of qi, but they had a general understanding of the situation. Naturally, they understood that the transformation of the chaotic chi into the innate chi and the transformation of the innate chi into the acquired chi of heaven and earth meant that the chi of heaven and earth had become stable. It was the inevitable growth of the heaven and earth, not a regression. Upon hearing this, Lao Dan's eyes brightened up. Rays of wisdom kept flashing in his mind and consciousness. Instability has turned into stability. So this is the mystery of Qi, Lao Dan murmured. A look of enlightenment flashed across his face. Lao Dan was a living creature born in the untainted land after the great tribulation of heaven and earth. He was a living creature that was between the innate Qi and the acquired Qi. Since he started cultivating, he had received the teachings of his senior masters and obtained countless treasures for his cultivation. He had also traveled in the untainted land for thousands of years. He had accumulated countless experiences. Of course, he had gained a lot. At the same time, it had also allowed him to inherit the cognition that the living creatures in the untainted land were accustomed to. For ordinary living creatures, they only felt that the more advanced and perfect a heaven and earth was, the more suitable it would be for cultivators to cultivate. The chi of heaven and earth should also be of a higher level, and the easier it would be for the living creatures to absorb. The more beneficial it would be to the living creatures. In this way, the untainted land would live up to its name of being advanced and perfect. Therefore, the quality of the chi in the untainted land was worse than before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It was more difficult for the cultivators to absorb it, and it was more difficult for the cultivators to cultivate. Naturally, they regarded this as a sign that the untainted land was degenerating and becoming less perfect. Since Lao Dan had inherited this cognition, he naturally thought so too. He even regarded it as common sense. At this moment, Luo Chunyang's words had directly shattered his cognition and opened another door to a wider heaven and earth in front of his deep-rooted concept. The heaven and earth did not exist specifically for living creatures or cultivators. The heaven and earth existed for its own existence. All living creatures were just appendages attached to the heaven and earth. They were incomparably important to them, but they were dispensable to the heaven and earth. Therefore, in order for the heaven and earth to grow and become perfect, it was impossible for all living creatures to be the protagonist. Naturally, it was impossible for the heaven and earth to change in a certain direction just to make it easier for the living creatures to cultivate. The changes needed by any heaven and earth were changes that would allow it to exist for a longer time. Only such changes could be considered as changes that could be considered as growth. Obviously, only stability could allow the heaven and earth to exist for a longer time. Only then could the heaven and earth be less likely to be destroyed by certain changes. From this point of view, the innate chi of heaven and earth was in a state that was extremely easy to degenerate, be absorbed by living creatures, and be consumed easily. It was obviously not suitable for the existence of a perfect heaven and earth. Only by becoming more stable and turning into a state that was less easily absorbed and consumed by living creatures could the innate chi of heaven and earth be considered as the growth of the heaven and earth. Therefore, when the innate chi of heaven and earth turned into the acquired chi of heaven and earth, it was naturally the growth of the heaven and earth. It was a kind of positive change. As soon as this idea was formed, Lao Dan suddenly felt that the layers of fog that covered his eyes in the past seemed to have dissipated a lot. Countless ideas that he thought were correct in the past suddenly showed countless omissions and contradictions at this moment. An indescribable joy filled his heart and mind. In a trance, he even felt that his cultivation realm had made great progress. His primordial spirit and celestial core power had become much purer and condensed than before. Junior brother Lao Dan is indeed a genius. No wonder you can cultivate to the golden immortal realm in just a few thousand years. Luo Chunyang could not help but exclaim in admiration when he saw the changes in Lao Dan. It's a pity that junior brother Lao Dan has cultivated the acquired primordial spirit. If he could cultivate the Tao fruit like us, The power of his supernatural power would not be so weak, Luo Guo lamented. Chapter 728. While speaking, Lao Dan had regained his senses. The divine light in his eyes became clearer and purer than before, as if many of the impurities in his eyes had been completely removed. It was as if his entire soul had undergone a baptism, and his vision was no longer the same as before. Words first, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo looked at Lao Dan and could not help but admire him. Thank you, senior brother and senior sister. I understand now. Lao Dan bowed to Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. There's no need to be so courteous between brothers. Junior brother Lao Dan, do you still have any doubts about whether the primitive world has been destroyed? Luo Chunyang smiled. I already believe that the primordial world has not been destroyed. After the Great Tribulation, it is more perfect than before the Great Tribulation. However, I'm still a little puzzled by the various performances. Senior brother, please explain, said the old turtle. Oh, is it because the sky is dark, the earth is broken, and the heavenly pillars are broken? Luo Chunyang asked. Yes, that was what Lao Dan was puzzled about. Although he knew that the primitive world must not have been destroyed by the battle during the Great Tribulation, he still could not understand the reasons other than the vitality. Since he did not understand why there were such phenomena, he naturally had to clarify it. It's not difficult to understand. The Great Tribulation of the heaven and earth has only passed for about 10,000 years, which is less than 1/10 of a period. Naturally, it's a transitional process. Look at the stars in the sky. Don't they look illusory? In the future, when the stars in the sky become completely real, the sun and the moon will return to the right track, and the sky will not be dark anymore. As for the destruction of the heavenly pillars in Buzhou Mountain, it's even simpler. It's because the primitive world has stabilized to the extent that it no longer needs the support of the heavenly pillars. Thus, the heavenly pillars have naturally been destroyed, Luo Chunyang said with a smile. His explanation made Lao Dan come to a sudden realization. Also, the Earth seems to be broken into more than 1,000 continents, but the overall area is 10 times larger than before. How is it considered destroyed? Luo Guo, who was at the side, interrupted. Obviously, she had a deep understanding of the changes in the Earth. At this moment, all the doubts in Lao Dan's mind were gone. He felt that the world had become better than ever. An indescribable sense of security rose from his heart. An endless hope seemed to be right in front of him. Being in the wreckage of a world that had been destroyed and being in a thriving world that was constantly growing was naturally completely different. In the past, Lao Dan thought that the heaven and earth had been destroyed and was heading towards destruction. Even Lao Dan felt depressed from time to time. He was vaguely worried that the heaven and earth would suddenly collapse with a loud bang, causing all living beings to perish along with it. This kind of pressure might not mean anything normally, but when he entered the deepest state of cultivation, he would naturally be disturbed, making him unable to wholeheartedly improve his cultivation, unable to devote himself to cultivation. With such a mentality, it was naturally impossible for him to unleash all of his cultivation potential and thus affect his cultivation achievements. At this very moment, Lao Dan understood that the world was flourishing and was moving towards a more glorious and perfect state. The pressure that was vaguely appearing in Lao Dan's heart finally disappeared completely. At that moment, the feeling was almost comparable to an incredible breakthrough in the cultivation realm. I see. It seems that all living beings' understanding of the heaven and earth has a huge deviation in the past 10,000 years. It's really amazing. Lao Dan let out a long sigh. At this moment, Luo Guo suddenly raised her eyebrows, and a meaningful smile appeared on her face. Almost at the same time as Luo Guo, Luo Chunyang's expression also changed slightly. He turned his head and looked somewhere in the void. After Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo's expressions changed for a while, Lao Dan also sensed something. His expression also changed slightly, and he looked at the void that Luo Chunyang was looking at. The void was about 100,000 miles away from here. The distance was extremely far for ordinary people, but for cultivators like Luo Chunyang, and the others who had achieved a high cultivation realm. It was only a short distance away. Seeing that Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo did not say anything, Lao Dan knew that they had let him handle the matter. He shouted softly and said, "May I know your name? Why did you come here to eavesdrop on our conversation?" His voice was gentle, but it was filled with a sense of awe. It traveled across the distance of 100,000 miles and blasted into the void. Long ears and an old face. You're indeed the true immortal Lao Dan. However, I didn't expect that the legendary true immortal Lao Dan has already cultivated to the level of a golden immortal. You've hidden it so well. At this moment, a hoarse voice came from the void. Then, the void fluctuated slightly, and a throne that was about 100 feet high broke through the void and appeared in that position. The high platform was made of stone, but no one knew what kind of stone it was made of. It looked extremely ancient and mysterious. It also emitted an ancient and desolate aura, as if it had walked out from the ancient myths and legends. There was a middle-aged man sitting on the throne. The man had a well-built body and a cold expression. The aura that radiated from his body was like a surging tide. Powerful ripples of energy surged through the surrounding space, causing ripples to form in the space. You're able to break through the chaotic void. It seems that you have at least the cultivation of a golden immortal. May I know your name? Lao Dan did not care that he was recognized by the man. Instead, he asked. His voice was still unhurried, showing a sense of calmness. When the middle-aged man heard Lao Dan's question, he chuckled and said, "I'm just a nobody. It doesn't matter what my name is. If you want to address me, you can call me Domain Dragon." Domain Dragon? Are you from the ruins of this city? I remember that this city was called Domain Dragon City. Luo Guo raised her head and said with a smile. So it's you guys. I didn't expect that after the tribulation of the humans and demons, the higher-ups of the Chunyang Crown Prince and Princess Guo, who triggered the tribulation, are still alive. When the middle-aged man heard Luo Guo's words, his facial expression changed drastically. The aura around him surged in all directions, causing more and more space ripples to appear in the surrounding void. After hearing what he said, Lao Dan came to a sudden realization. He no longer had any doubts about the man's identity. This man was obviously a creature who survived the tribulation of the world. He might be from the human race or the demon race. Besides, he should have a close relationship with Domain Dragon City. He might even have survived in Domain Dragon City. That was why he called himself Domain Dragon. Judging from his attitude toward Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo at this time, it was obvious that he also thought that the chaotic world had been destroyed by the war between the humans and the demons. He was extremely dissatisfied and even resentful. Luo Fu was the emperor of Tianwang of the Daluo dynasty. Luo Chunyang was his only son, so he was naturally the crown prince. Therefore, Luo Chunyang was respectfully called Crown Prince Chunyang in the Daluo dynasty. Luo Guo was the only daughter of Luo Fu, so she was called Princess Guo. Only the creatures before the tribulation would know such a title. The middle-aged man stood up from the throne. His expression changed. He seemed to be angry, happy, resentful, and dead. It was so complicated that no words could describe what he was feeling at this time. Now that the Daluo dynasty no longer exists, there's no need to mention the titles Crown Prince Chunyang and Princess Guo. We're just ordinary cultivators now. Luo Chunyang sighed. He understood what this man was thinking. Regardless of whether this man was from the human race or the demon race, in his opinion, the destruction of the world was caused by the battle between the higher-ups of the human race and the demon race. To him, the two higher-ups of the human race were the main culprits of the destruction of the world. It might be an exaggeration to say that he wanted to kill them, but he did not want to welcome them. There was a soft swoosh. The middle-aged man's throne took him across a distance of 100,000 miles in an instant. He appeared directly in front of Luo Fu and the others. They were less than 1,000 feet away. At this place, the aura emitted by the throne was tens of thousands of times clearer than when it was 100,000 miles away. The three of them could clearly feel the powerful power condensed in the throne. As for the middle-aged man, He was able to see the three of them even more clearly, recognizing every single detail of their bodies. How dare you say these words so casually? Are you really so cold-blooded and heartless? The middle-aged man stood on the throne and looked down at Luo Chunyang and the others. He gritted his teeth. As he spoke, the power in his body trembled. A thunderous sound rang out from his body, shaking the space around him. It caused the Yuan Qi within a radius of tens of thousands of kilometers to violently riot. It was as if the entire space was enraged along with his rage. Sensing the power of this man, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were convinced that this man was from the human race. Moreover, he was a golden immortal from the human race who had cultivated the innate weapon cultivation method to the golden immortal realm. His power was hundreds of times more powerful than Lao Dan's. Of course, even if his power was 100 times more powerful than Lao Dan's, he was still just an ant in front of Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. The two of them could even crush him into pieces with one finger. Even so, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were not interested in this at all. Even if the middle-aged man who called himself Domain Dragon spoke rudely to them and looked down on them in such a condescending manner, they did not have any thoughts of crushing him. After all, although they did not feel guilty, they also knew the reason why this man was feeling. They could understand his actions, so they did not take it seriously. There are some things that you don't know, so I won't blame you for being disrespectful to me, Luo Chunyang said calmly. The middle-aged man almost exploded when he saw Luo Chunyang's lack of guilt. However, for some reason, he did not attack Luo Chunyang. Instead, he roared and said, "I don't care what the secret behind this is. I only know that in that great war, there are only tens of thousands of humans left in the entire untainted land. I only know that the once prosperous untainted land has returned to its primitive state. All the creatures that I am familiar with are gone. I only know that the entire land has been broken into thousands of pieces. I only know that the endless pneuma between heaven and earth has been consumed and degraded into the acquired pneuma today. No matter what the reason is, even if there's a big reason, I will never think that you are innocent." As the middle-aged man roared, a dark cloud suddenly appeared in the sky. In an instant, the heaven and earth within a radius of 10,000 miles became even darker. Only the light emitted from his body made him look like an angry god. Luo Chunyang frowned and waved his hand. The dark cloud dissipated and the world became bright again. The light emitted by the middle-aged man was no longer conspicuous. It was like a faint fluorescent light. After dispersing it, he raised his hand and clenched it lightly. The middle-aged man felt an endless pressure pressing down on him from all directions, causing him to feel his entire body shrinking rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he was about to turn into minced meat. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, his body suddenly became light. That pressure disappeared completely, as if it had never appeared. He looked around and found that his line of sight was dozens of feet lower than before. The distance between him and Prince Chunyang and Princess Guo had also shrunk to a few feet. With a thought, he found that the throne under him had disappeared and returned to his body. He was now directly facing Prince Chunyang and Princess Guo. He couldn't help but be horrified by this discovery. It was not that he had lost the support of his soul after losing the throne, that he had become extremely timid and insecure, but from the moment his throne disappeared, he found that his strength was as insignificant as an ant in front of the pure Yang Crown Prince. The pure Yang Crown Prince only needed to raise his hand, and he could make his weapon lose its function. Under such circumstances, even if he exhausted all his strength, it would not have the slightest effect on the pure Yang Crown Prince. This was the source of his horror. In an instant, the middle-aged man felt like his heart had died. He felt like his life had collapsed, and he no longer had any meaning. I exhausted everything I had to cultivate to become a gold immortal by chance. I didn't expect them to play with everything in the world like a chess piece and easily cultivate a divine ability that's 10,000 times stronger than mine. Where's the justice? This was the only thought that echoed in the man's mind. That's right. Although he had treated Luo Chunyang and the others as the culprits who had caused the destruction of the world and the extinction of all living beings. The truth was that he did not think that he was clean. Thus, he did not seek out Luo Chunyang and the others to take revenge and fight them to the death. That was why he did not fight Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo when he discovered them. It was just that he was unwilling to acknowledge their identities as the crown prince and princess. However, the fact that he did not have any thoughts of seeking revenge against them did not mean that he was willing to be weaker than them. The truth was the exact opposite. Because he didn't have the right to seek revenge, he had an obsession in his heart, a belief that their actions were wrong and that they would not have a good ending. Because of this obsession, he didn't want his cultivation to be weaker than Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. Because of this belief, he almost collapsed when he found out that Luo Chunyang's divine ability was so much stronger than his. Luo Chunyang cultivated the Tao of fruits and had reached the peak of golden immortal. It was impossible for him not to have some pride. Therefore, although he could understand the middle-aged man's feelings, he was unwilling to raise his head and talk to the middle-aged man. That was why he pushed the middle-aged man's throne back into his body, making it so that it could no longer appear in the outside world. Now, he saw the middle-aged man suddenly become so dejected after the throne disappeared. He couldn't help but frown. The middle-aged man's emotions were so complicated. No matter how much Luo Chunyang understood the human heart, how could he see the reason why the middle-aged man became so dejected? Although he didn't think the middle-aged man became a coward after losing the protection of the throne, he still thought that the man's cultivation of the Tao heart was extremely lacking. This was different from the impression he gave Luo Chunyang before. Naturally, Luo Chunyang was disappointed. However, he didn't have much relationship with the middle-aged man, so he didn't care too much about him. He said, "You'll know the truth in the future. It's useless to talk about it now." As he spoke, he felt that it was meaningless to stay here. He said to Luo Guo and Lao Dan, "Let's go." As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately turned into a rainbow and flew toward the northwest direction. Luo Guo looked at the middle-aged man and sighed. However, she did not say anything. With a sway of her figure, she turned into a streak of light and followed Luo Chunyang. This time, she didn't bring Lao Dan along. Luo Chunyang's speed was not very fast. Lao Dan could catch up with him, so she didn't need to bring him along. Yu Qiu Dao, you can't just look at the surface of things. There's still a long way to go. What happens in the future may change your mind, Lao Dan said to the middle-aged man. Then, he turned into a rainbow and chased after Luo Guo and Luo Chunyang. Based on Lao Dan's original identity, Yu Qiu was naturally his senior, an existence that he needed to pay homage to. However, at this moment, he had been accepted as a disciple by Guangpu. Even though he didn't think that his identity was any higher than before, it was inappropriate for him to face these seniors and masters like before. He had to take Guangpu's face into consideration. If he still paid homage to them like before, how would Guangpu keep her face? Therefore, he had no choice but to pay homage to them 1,000 times more than before. Lao Dan's words were like a bolt of lightning that woke the middle-aged man up from his daze. He raised his hand and tried to grab Lao Dan. However, his strength was scattered, so he couldn't grab Lao Dan in time. He could only ask anxiously, "What do you mean? Are all the clansmen still alive?" His words spread far away, but he didn't get any answer. When he collected the scattered strength and flew into the sky, he found that he had completely lost track of Luo, Chunyang, and the others. It was as if they had never appeared before. "Hey, what's going on? Answer me." The middle-aged man yelled at the sky. His voice rolled like thunder, shocking the living beings within a radius of millions of miles. Chapter 729. Brother, I remember that Grandpa gave us a task that we haven't completed yet. Why don't we take this opportunity to complete it? Somewhere in the void, billions of miles away from the ruins of Domain Dragon City, Luo Guo said to Luo Chunyang. TXT ebook, download ***. Are you talking about preaching in the untainted land? Luo Chunyang's eyes lit up as he understood what Luo Guo was talking about. Yes. The untainted land today is completely different from the past. We finally have the ability to preach in the untainted land. In the past, only the martial uncles could do this. Luo Guo was excited. At this moment, the two of them had recovered from the emotions caused by their encounter with Domain Dragon. Their mood had returned to its original state of excitement. After all, they did not think that they had wronged Domain Dragon, nor did they think that they had done anything wrong. Their exclamation just now was just because they suddenly met someone who was familiar with them and recalled the past. Since they had left that place, they naturally did not need to keep that feeling in their heart anymore. This is a good idea. When father and mother got married, they let the Pangu primordial spirit, which was integrated with the divine souls of many innate gods, return to the supreme way. Although it made the supreme way complete, it also caused us to form karma with many innate gods. We must give them the opportunity of the Pangu primordial spirit in order to end this karma, Luo Chunyang explained to Lao Dan with a smile. I see. In this case, preaching in the untainted land is also a must. Lao Dan suddenly realized, well, since we have decided, let's set up a constitution to avoid the consequences in the future. Indeed, we should set up a constitution. Otherwise, we can't improve the efficiency. Luo Chunyang nodded and frowned as he began to think. Constitution. Why don't we set up a sect? Lao Dan suggested. Sect? No. We have masters. If the masters don't set up a sect, how can we, the disciples, set up a sect? Luo Chunyang frowned and said, Why? I think it's a good idea to set up a sect. Grandpa and the others did not set up a sect because they were not interested. If we set up a sect, it would be good for all living beings in the untainted land to know the merits of Grandpa and the others. They would definitely be happy to see it happen. Luo Guo was the opposite of Luo Chunyang. She thought that setting up a sect was extremely good. Grandpa is almost omnipotent. We're the living beings of the primordial world to him. Why would he need all living beings to know about his merits? How could they be happy to see us establish a sect? Luo Chunyang still had a bad feeling. Big brother, how could you do this? Luo Guo's eyes widened when she heard this. What about me? Luo Chunyang couldn't help but be at a loss after being glared at by Luo Guo. One had to know that Luo Guo had always been gentle and obedient to her brother, but she had never treated him with such an attitude. How could he not be at a loss when such a sudden change occurred? What happened? Could it be that Grandpa doesn't care if everyone knows about his merits and virtues, but we, the younger generation, can ignore it? It's one thing if Grandpa doesn't care about it, but it's another matter if we do it or not. How can you think like this? Luo Guo was very dissatisfied. Well, I'm wrong. We should indeed set up a sect to let all living beings know about the merits of Grandpa and the others. What else could Luo Chunyang do? He could only smile bitterly. Well, that's right. Luo Guo could not help but be overjoyed when she saw Luo Chunyang giving in. It sounds so nice, but in fact, it's because I'm playful. However, what she said is somewhat reasonable. As a younger generation, I can't not show my filial piety just because Grandpa and the others don't care about it. Well, I'll do as she says. Luo Chunyang looked at Luo Guo's joyful expression, and this thought flashed across his mind. What kind of sect should we call our sect? Luo Guo asked Luo Chunyang and Lao Dan excitedly. Well, you decide, Luo Chunyang said helplessly. Senior sister, let's just name it whatever you think is suitable, Lao Dan also said. How can we do that? This is a very serious matter. In any case, we have to mobilize all our wisdom to think of the most perfect sect name. This is related to luck and karma. We can't ignore it. How can I just decide it casually? Luo Guo said discontentedly. So, you still know that you can just do whatever you want. This was the only thought in Luo Chunyang's mind. Then, why don't we call it Ren Sect? Lao Dan's eyes were also filled with helplessness. However, a thought flashed across his mind, and he said, Ren Sect? That's not good. Wouldn't it limit the scope of our preaching to the human race? This is contrary to the original intention of preaching to the primitive world. Luo Guo frowned and thought for a while before she shook her head and said, Then why don't we call it Chan Sect? A sect that explains the teachings of the Great Way is not contrary to the original intention of preaching to the primitive world. Luo Chunyang thought of something. The two-word Chan sect were suddenly born out of nothingness and directly occupied his mind. He felt that this name seemed to have an extremely mysterious connection with him and must not be abandoned. Similarly, when Lao Dan said the two words were insect, he also felt that this name seemed to have a certain connection with himself. It was related to his future and his own Tao. Therefore, he did not care much about this name before he said it. However, after he said it, he felt that these two names should not disappear from his life. Chan sect, a sect that explains the teachings of the Great Way? That's not good. The Tao that we cultivate can only be achieved by seeking the Great Way from the heaven and earth. How can the explanation of the Great Way fully reflect the essence of cultivation? I think it's better to call it Jia sect, which intercepts a ray of vitality from the heaven and earth and intercepts the mystery of the Great Way. Well, this name can reflect the essence of our cultivation. Let's call it this name. Luo was said. At the beginning of her speech, her spirit was still a little shaken. However, as she spoke, her eyes emitted a determined light, expressing her firm intention of not abandoning the name Jia sect. Obviously, when the two words Jia sect came out of her mouth, she also sensed the connection between the two words and herself. She also felt the importance of the two words to her. At Luo Guo's cultivation level, any intuition was a crucial hint to her. It was a feeling that could make her believe in it more than the thoughts in her heart. Under such circumstances, with the feeling that the two words Jia sect were extremely important to her, how could she not be firm? The three of them looked at each other and saw the determination in each other's eyes. They could tell how much importance each of them attached to the names that they mentioned. They could not help but feel terrified. Could it be that all of you have the same feeling? Luo Chunyang said with a frown. Although he did not say what exactly he felt, Luo Guo and Lao Dan both understood what Luo Chunyang was talking about. Therefore, they could not help but nod, indicating that what Luo Chunyang said was the truth. Seeing that both of them nodded, Luo Chunyang let out a long sigh of relief. Instead, his expression became joyful. He said, "I see. It seems that I now understand why Father and Mother asked us to travel to the untainted land at this time." Although the power of Luo Guo's and Lao Dan's supernatural power was very different, they were, after all, in the golden immortal realm. Naturally, their minds were extraordinary. As soon as they heard Luo Chunyang's words, various strange visions flashed across their minds. They instantly understood what Luo Chunyang was talking about. "Brother, are you saying that Father and Mother have already found out that the three of us have a wonderful relationship with the three major sects?" Luo Guo asked with a frown. Although I don't know what Master and Uncle Master are thinking, with their supernatural power, they must have seen many things that we can't. I think the establishment of the three major sects must be extremely important to our future achievements. Otherwise, they wouldn't have asked us to travel to the untainted land at this time, and we wouldn't have such a wonderful feeling about the names of the three sects, Lao Dan said. Well, we'll find out in the future. Since we all have such a feeling about the names of the sects, let's establish the three major sects. The three of us shall be called the Three Pristines. From now on, I'll be immortal pure yang, Luo Chunyang concluded. As soon as he said this, he felt extremely comfortable. In a trance, he felt that the supreme Tao seemed to have some kind of wonderful vibration, as if it was dancing in joy. It seemed that the distance between him and the supreme Tao had become closer. It seemed that the difficulty of activating the supreme Tao was hundreds of times less than before. This feeling made him instantly understand that what he said just now must be extremely correct. At least, it was incomparably in line with the requirements of this world. Three sects? The three pristines. All right, we'll establish the three major sections. Brother, you're immortal pure yang, and you'll establish the Chan sect. I'll establish the Jia sect, and from today on, I'll be immortal pure yang, Luo Guo said joyfully. As soon as she said this, she also felt that her mind was clear. It seemed that the supreme Tao that was extremely vague and distant in the past had become clearer, and the distance between them had also become closer. At the same time, he seemed to feel that the supreme great Tao was shaking in joy. She looked at Luo Chunyang and saw that he had a satisfied look on his face. Knowing that this feeling was not unique to her, she was even more delighted. When Lao Dan heard the conversation between the two of them, he suddenly felt that his heart was beating faster. All of a sudden, a sense of destiny emerged from the depths of his primordial spirit. Under this sense of destiny, his voice became extremely distant and deep. Then, the sect that I'll establish will be the Rin sect. From today on, I'll be immortal pure Daoda. As soon as he finished speaking, the celestial core power in his body vibrated. There seemed to be some kind of indescribable force descending on his body, constantly cleansing both inside and outside of his body, including his primordial spirit, his celestial core power, his body, and even the slightest and deepest corner of his body. With this cleansing, his state of mind rose infinitely and finally reached an unprecedented level. The supreme great Tao became incomparably clear in his eyes, and at this moment, the boundless supreme great Tao displayed its infinite profundity and supreme power to him in an unprecedented way. After all, Lao Dan only cultivated the cultivation method of the acquired primordial spirit. Even though he had cultivated to the golden immortal realm, he was still far inferior to Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua, who cultivated the Tao fruit. Therefore, although the changes that the three of them sensed were similar, and the benefits that they obtained were not much different, Lao Dan's performance was many times greater than that of Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua. Waves of acquired turbid qi continuously drifted out of Lao Dan's body, and his body became younger in the process. His white hair turned black, and the skin around his face disappeared. His body grew taller and stronger. An indescribable, innate aura gradually emanated from his body, giving him the aura that only an innate god could have. The celestial core power in his body was cleansed to the point that it was only a millionth of the original. However, at the same time, it was thousands of times purer than before. It became golden, and there was an eternal aura emanating from the golden celestial core power. His primordial spirit was also thousands of times smaller than before. It became so small that it was almost undetectable. However, the aura was much purer and stronger than before. At this moment, the aura on Lao Dan's body was faintly on par with that of Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua. Although the difference in quantity had become greater, it would only take a long time to make up for the gap. After a long time, Lao Dan let out a long sigh, and a joyful smile appeared on his face. Junior brother, congratulations on returning to the innate realm. You've finally made up for your innate deficiency. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo congratulated Lao Dan happily. Although Lao Dan was a naturally born living creature after the great tribulation of heaven and earth, he was not completely born in the chaotic qi of Hun or the innate qi. Instead, he was born in the presence of countless acquired qi of heaven and earth. Therefore, he was not a complete innate being in essence. He was still an acquired living creature, and he could only be considered as a half-innate being. Because of this, he did not have the innate aura of an innate deity. At this moment, he had such an innate aura on his body. This was enough to show that he had returned to the innate realm, just like how he cultivated the Tao fruit. It could be considered as making up for the most innate deficiency. In the future, his cultivation speed will be tens of thousands of times faster than before. How could this not be gratifying? Thank you, senior brother. Thank you, senior sister. Lao Dan thanked them happily. At this moment, Lao Dan was no longer as old and frail as before. However, he did not regain the appearance of a young man. Instead, he looked like a middle-aged man, and he even looked a little old. Obviously, returning to the innate realm did not completely change the characteristics of his innate aging. Junior brother, your body is empty now. Let's find a place to cultivate first. When you've recovered to your peak, we'll continue to move forward, Luo Chunyang said. That's good too. I also want to experience the changes in my body. Luogwa nodded and said. Since they had already said so, Lao Dan naturally would not say anything else to object. Immediately, they chose a mountain peak not far away from them and built a mansion there. They set up a big formation that could condense the vitality of heaven and earth into the innate chi and then into the hun chi of chaos. They continuously gathered all the vitality within a radius of tens of millions of miles into the mansion for Lao Dan's cultivation. Even Lao Dan was taught all the cultivation methods by Guang Pu. Since Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua were the children of Luo Fu and Guang Pu, how could they be inferior to Lao Dan? This kind of formation that could turn the acquired into the innate realm was considered to be almost heaven-defying in the eyes of the future generations. However, it was nothing to them. They could almost set it up casually, and it did not even require much effort from them. When Luo Chunyang, Luo Gua, and Lao Dan established the three great sects and named themselves as three pristine ones, Luo Fan, who was far away in the Wuji Palace in the void, suddenly felt a jolt in his heart. He suddenly woke up from the deep state of meditation. He opened his eyes that had been closed for hundreds of billions of years. When he looked up, he had already penetrated the barrier of the infinite time and space and seen the supreme Tao of the primitive world. He could clearly see the wonderful changes that were taking place on it. At this moment, his comprehension towards the profundities of the Daoyuo truth Tao was still far from reaching the end, and his cultivation was far from reaching the peak of the Daoyuo truth Tao. However, compared to when he had just attained the Daoyuo truth Tao, it was countless times more profound. He might be able to see the subtle changes of the supreme Tao with his own eyes in the past, but he could never do it so easily and freely, as if he was looking at the lines on his palm. With this, he could clearly see the changes that had taken place in the primitive world in the past tens of thousands of years. He could even see how Lao Dan became the disciple of Guang Pu, how Guang Pu attained the Tai Dao fruit, and how Luo Chunyang, Luo Gua, and Lao Dan named themselves as three pristine ones. He could not help but frown when he saw these clearly. Then, he slowly relaxed his brows. I see. I didn't expect that the three pristine ones would return to their positions at this time. Moreover, Chunyang and Gua have also become two of the three pristine ones. Their status is even higher than mine. Such thoughts flashed across his mind. In this way, Chunyang and Gua will definitely be endlessly blessed by the Supreme Tao. Any bottleneck in their cultivation will no longer be able to restrain them. It is almost certain that they will reach the peak of the Daoyuo Zhen Dao in the future. I'm afraid that only attaining the primordial Hun Dao fruit can restrain them, but their future is boundless. However, in this way, it will be difficult to sever the connection between them and the primitive world. If anything happens to the primitive world in the future, I'm afraid that they will be the first ones to suffer. His mind raced as he instantly understood the advantages and disadvantages of Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua becoming two of the three pure ones. However, it doesn't matter. With Chunyang and Gua's aptitude, it is almost impossible for them to attain the Dao fruit of Daoyuo Zhen Dao fruit, let alone attain the peak of the Daoyuo Zhen Dao without the blessing of the Supreme Tao. In this way, there is no difference between the connection between them and the primitive world. Although the connection between them and the world has become closer, there are still more advantages than disadvantages. Luo Fan smiled faintly as he thought of this. I didn't expect the three pristine ones to appear in this way. Luo Fan sighed with a smile. After sighing with emotion, he closed his eyes again and entered the deepest state of meditation that he had been in for hundreds of billions of years. He tried his best to understand the various mysteries of the realm of the Daoyuo Zhen Dao. Hashtag Chapter 730. Time passed by slowly. Text first. In the blink of an eye, another 10,000 years had passed. In the past 10,000 years, the number of living beings in the untainted world had increased by many times compared to 10,000 years ago. However, compared to the entire untainted world, it was still insignificant. The entire untainted world was still primitive and barren. In the past 10,000 years, the civilization of cultivation in the untainted world had become many times more prosperous than it was 10,000 years ago. Among them, the most special thing was that the Qing continent, which was extremely barren and almost extinct in the past 10,000 years, had risen in an unimaginable way. Instead, it had become the continent with the most prosperous cultivation civilization among the 9 continents. The number of cultivators in the Qing continent had completely surpassed the number of cultivators in the other 8 continents. Although it was still far from the number before the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth, it no longer looked like the scene after the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth. In the Qing continent, every cultivator had a concept similar to faith in their heart. That was the unparalleled respect for a certain existence that had appeared in the Qing continent in the past 10,000 years. The existence that all the cultivators in the Qing continent admired was none other than the 3 pure ones, Yu Qing, Qing Qing, and Tai Qing. The cultivators of the Qing continent looked no different from the cultivators of other continents. But if a cultivator was disrespectful to the 3 clear Taoists in front of them, they would definitely be enraged and would definitely make the disrespectful cultivator apologize or pay the price. The reason for this was very simple. In the past 10,000 years, the 3 pure ones formed by Luo Chunyang, Luo Guo, and Lao Dan had been preaching in the Qing continent as they had decided in the beginning. They had given countless living beings the opportunity to enter the Tao and cultivate. Thus, the prosperous cultivation civilization in the Qing continent had made the Qing continent stand out among the 9 continents. It had almost become the holy land of cultivation in the entire untainted world from the barren land. In the process, the 3 pure ones did not ask for anything from them. He did not ask them to do anything at all. He simply gave them benefits. How could they remain indifferent to such a virtue? Therefore, the title of Taoist 3 pure ones had long surpassed the so-called 6 ancestors, 8 saints, 3 gods, and 7 Buddhas in the Qing continent. Although they knew that they were not omnipotent, their position in the hearts of the cultivators was supreme. As for the Chan school, Jie school, and Rin school created by the 3 pure ones, they were still not famous. Not many people knew about them. I didn't receive another disciple. It is truly a pity. At the northwest side of the Qing continent, Luo Guo sighed helplessly. Didn't you claim to teach everyone regardless of background? As long as it's a sentient being, it can be accepted into the sect? Why don't you accept it as a disciple? Luo Chunyang laughed. Although I teach without discrimination, why don't you take a look at what it is? It was an earthworm, a scavenging earthworm that grew after birth. It doesn't even have the slightest Tao heart. How can I accept it as a disciple? Luo Guo rolled her eyes and said. At this moment, they were at the end of the northwest side of the Qing continent. Luo Chunyang, Luo Guo, and Lao Dan were floating in the void 1,000 feet above the ground. Under their feet, a strange 3 feet long earthworm was looking around with its head raised. Its body was letting out a whine, which obviously contained a sense of reluctance. Obviously, this earthworm was the scavenging earthworm that Luo Guo mentioned. Judging from its appearance, it was apparent that Luo Guo had taught this scavenging earthworm some cultivation methods. However, she did not accept it as a disciple. Instead, she disappeared from the earthworm's perception after she taught it. Although they were only standing 1,000 feet above the earthworm, they did not emit any aura. They could not be seen from below at all. How could the scavenging earthworm detect them? Also, brother, why don't you accept any disciples? I can understand that junior brother Lao Dan would rather have nothing than a substandard disciple. However, why didn't you accept any disciple even though you taught so many cultivation methods for the past 10,000 years? Luo Guo said helplessly. Even you can't accept a disciple. Although my requirements are not as high as junior brother Lao Dan's, they are much higher than yours, Luo Chunyang said with a smile. However, there is no disciple in the 3 sects of the 3 pure ones. It's just an empty title, Lao Dan said with a frown. You're the least qualified to speak. A person who is only willing to accept one disciple is not qualified to say that he's expanding the sect. Luo Guo rolled her eyes and said to Lao Dan. Upon hearing that, Lao Dan chuckled and dared not say anything else. Luo Chunyang, Luo Gua, and Lao Dan called themselves the Three Pure Ones. After they founded the Chan sect, the Jie sect, and the Rin sect, they decided to spread the cultivation methods in the untainted land to the greatest extent. They wanted to increase the number of cultivators in the untainted land to the greatest extent so that they could complete the task assigned by Luo Fan. However, when they really decided to spread the cultivation methods, they found that the situation was very different from what they had expected. In their original thoughts, the primordial world was a boundless continent. Wouldn't it be easy to find people with extraordinary aptitude and take them in as disciples to strengthen the sect? As long as they looked around casually, they would definitely be able to find them. They even had to worry that the sect would become uneven due to the large number of people. However, when they really observed the many living beings in the untainted land from the perspective of accepting them as disciples, they realized how ridiculous their thoughts were. Indeed, the untainted land was giving birth to countless living beings every moment. Among them, the number of intelligent living beings was definitely not small. However, because these living beings did not have any inheritance and did not have a long period of accumulation, they were simply stupid and simple-minded. Although their spiritual sense was complete, they could not change at all. With such qualifications, if they wanted to go far on the path of cultivation, they would need to spend thousands of times more energy than ordinary living beings. How could they be accepted as disciples? Even those who were born smart did not have a heart to pursue Tao. They only wanted to pursue power. They were completely blinded by power and could not see the existence of the truth of cultivation. Such living beings might have a relatively fast cultivation speed in the beginning, but their future would be limited in the future. They might even step on the path of evil and become a disaster in the untainted land. Therefore, it was even more impossible to accept them as disciples. Therefore, in these years, not to mention that Lao Dan did not meet any disciples that he liked. Even Luo Gua, who claimed to have no discrimination and wanted to strengthen the Jie clan as much as possible, could not be cruel enough to accept these living beings as disciples. Therefore, in these tens of thousands of years, they constantly looked for intelligent living beings and continuously taught these living beings the cultivation methods. They tested the qualifications of these intelligent living beings and tested their Tao heart. However, at the same time, they were constantly disappointed. This method allowed them to stay in the Qingzhou continent for far longer than their original plan. Originally, it would only take them a few hundred years to cross the Qingzhou continent and arrive at the extreme northwest of this place. However, because of the slow and unwilling search, it took them a total of tens of thousands of years to arrive at this place and was about to leave the Qingzhou continent. Well, we've only passed through one continent. There are still hundreds of continents in front of us. If we continue to move forward, we'll definitely be able to accept disciples and strengthen the sect, Luo Chunyang said helplessly. That's the only way. Sai, why are the aptitudes of all the creatures born after the great tribulation of heaven and earth so bad? Even the worst aptitudes of the creatures born before the great tribulation of heaven and earth are many times better than these creatures, Luo Gua complained helplessly. That's for sure. Before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, the world was filled with innate vitality. All living beings have been baptized by endless innate vitality during the process of their birth. How could their qualifications be poor? Now that the innate vitality of heaven and earth has turned into the acquired realm, the process of the birth of the living beings is different. Naturally, their qualifications are not as good as before, Lao Dan sighed helplessly. Compared to Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua, Lao Dan was a living being born after the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Therefore, he had a closer relationship with the living beings born in this world. Therefore, he could not be as indifferent to the changes in the living beings before and after the great tribulation of heaven and earth like Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua. That was why he said such words at this moment. That makes sense, but the difference is just too big. Even if we can't casually find a living being that's qualified to be our disciple like before the Great Calamity, it shouldn't be that we can't even find a single such living being in an entire continent. Luo sighed helplessly. Ha ha, hua. Have you forgotten that only 20,000 years have passed since the great tribulation of heaven and earth? The stars have not even been fully formed yet, Luo Chunyang said with a smile. About that, I've indeed forgotten, Luo sighed. She raised her head and saw that the starry sky was still the same. The sun and the moon appeared in the sky at the same time, but their light was restrained. The brightness difference between the two stars seemed to be on par with each other. It was as if two huge disks were dominating the entire starry sky. The endless stars were much more realistic than 10,000 years ago, but they still looked a little illusory. Obviously, they had not been fully formed yet. It's only the past 20,000 years. I'm indeed being too demanding. A genius like junior brother Lao Dan doesn't appear easily. Luo Guo stared blankly at the sky for a while and sighed helplessly. Well, there's still hundreds of continents ahead. According to our speed in the Qin continent, I'm afraid it's a little difficult for us to reach our destination within 1,000,000 years, Luo Chunyang said with a frown. It doesn't matter. Anyway, we're just going to the destination conveniently. We don't have to rush there at the fastest speed. Isn't it better to preach along the way while walking slowly? Luo Guo said with a smile. Senior sister, you're right, Lao Dan said with a smile. After 10,000 years, Lao Dan's mentality was no longer the same as it was 10,000 years ago. At this moment, although he still could not treat a few periods as a short period of time like Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo, he no longer regarded hundreds of thousands of years as an unimaginable period of time. The power was cut off for a few hours, and it was only restored just now. So this is all I have left. Chapter 731. After listening to Lao Dan's words, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo nodded with a smile. Text first, although one had to set a goal for traveling, it was not necessarily for that goal. As long as one could gain something along the way, even if the final goal was not achieved, it would still be considered a successful trip. Moreover, it was not that they were not going to the place where the continent disappeared. They were just slowing down their journey. After nodding and smiling, Luo Chunyang looked at Lao Dan with a gratified expression and said, Junior brother Lao Dan, you finally have the heart of immortality that matches your cultivation level. This is really gratifying. It's my fault for making you worry all these years, senior brother. Lao Dan also smiled. All right. Although it doesn't matter how long it takes, it's not a good time to waste. What are we waiting for? Luo Guo said helplessly when she saw the two of them being jealous. Luo Chunyang and Lao Dan looked at each other and smiled. They did not say anything else and nodded in agreement with Luo Guo. Luo Guo raised her hand and pointed at the void. Then, endless acquired vitality was condensed and combined with the endless evil energy. It turned into a colorful cloud that appeared under her feet and lifted her up. Carrying her, he flew forward at a speed that was neither fast nor slow. Don't say that we're in a hurry. This method of traveling is much slower than the normal speed. Luo Chunyang sighed when he saw it. However, he did not say anything. He also condensed the acquired vitality and evil energy to form a light green cloud under his feet. Then, he followed behind Luo Guo and moved forward. Lao Dan already had the heart of immortality that matched with his cultivation experience. His patience was much greater than before. Naturally, he would not say anything. He also condensed a cloud that was made up of the energy of the heaven and the earth and the chi of evil. However, because the ratio of the cloud was different from Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo, it had a water-like luster and was chasing after the two of them. Very good. Over the past 10,000 years, Lao Dan had completely filled up the void of power that appeared after he transformed the acquired to the innate. Although he still had not found a way to transform his acquired primordial spirit into the Tao of fruit, he had already transformed the acquired primordial spirit into the innate primordial spirit. In other words, it was another kind of Tao similar to the Tao of primordial spirit. This method was naturally not as profound and vast as the Tao Fruit Grand Tao, but still had its own profundities, and its power was on the same level as the Tao Fruit Grand Tao. In other words, in the same cultivation realm, the difference between Lao Dan, who cultivated this kind of innate primordial spirit, and Lao Dan, who cultivated the Tao of fruit, would not be more than 100 times. It was precisely because of this foundation that Old Turtle was able to use his divine abilities with much greater ease compared to 10,000 years ago. He could also condense the acquired chi of heaven and earth and the baleful aura like this 10,000 years ago, but he couldn't do it so easily and casually. As for the cloud that was formed, it was impossible for it to possess such mystical power. 3 clouds were drifting forward unhurriedly in the boundless ocean. Perhaps the speed was extremely fast for ordinary cultivators, but to them, it didn't seem like they were traveling at all. Instead, it seemed like they were traveling. The one controlling this speed was Luo Gua. At this moment, she was looking down with great interest. Her eyes emitted an invisible light that pierced through the boundless seawater and saw all kinds of scenes in the depths of the sea. Suddenly, with a thought, her body shook, and she drilled down directly into the seawater. Nonsense! When Luo Chunyang saw this, he knew that Luo Gua's playful personality had erupted again. He sighed helplessly and said to Lao Dan, "Junior brother, let's go to the bottom of the sea too." What else could Lao Dan say? He could only nod his head and said, "It's interesting to go to the bottom of the sea." With that, the two of them followed behind Luo Gua and also drilled into the seawater below. The 3 of them were powerful beings in the golden immortal realm. It was normal for them to drill into the mountains and swim in the sea. Therefore, to them, entering the sea only caused a slight change in the environment, but it did not cause them any discomfort. However, the seawater was different from the void after all. If they wanted to travel at the same speed as in the void, they would need to consume more energy. That was why they didn't choose to travel this way before. Found it, Luo Gua cheered when they drilled into the seawater. As she cheered, a strange light burst out from the depths of the sea below. It instantly filled the sea within a radius of 10 miles, turning the seawater within this range invisible. Luo Chunyang and Lao Dan looked at the source of the light and instantly saw Luo Gua in the light, as well as a strange creature in front of her. So it's because of this human-faced fish. When Luo Chunyang and Lao Dan saw this, they instantly understood why Luo Gua suddenly sank into the sea in such a hurry. They could not help but laugh. Since they knew the reason, they were not in a hurry to meet up with Luo Gua. With a thought in their mind, their bodies naturally became invisible. This was the practice that they had agreed to do for the past 10,000 years. When one of the 3 of them wanted to teach a certain creature, the other 2 must hide themselves and not expose themselves. The reason was very simple. After all, the 3 of them had founded 3 different religions. Even if they were collectively known as the 3 pristine ones, there were still differences. The person who taught the 3 religions did not only represent the 3 pristine ones, but also a certain religion. If the 3 of them appeared at the same time, it was very likely that the creature who was taught the 3 religions would be at a loss of what to do. Of course, it would not be good. Greetings, great immortal. Please accept me as your disciple. The human-faced fish kept kowtowing to Luo Gua and begged. Although Luo Gua was innocent and mischievous in front of Luo Chunyang and Lao Dan, in front of other cultivators, even if she behaved as usual, she would become noble and respectable. At this moment, he was looking at the human-faced fish with great interest. The aura around him was faintly fluctuating, revealing an indescribably mysterious aura. It was as if the entire sea and the void were faintly vibrating and fluctuating according to his thoughts. On the other hand, the cheer she let out earlier was something that the corpse fish had never heard before. In the eyes of the corpse fish, Luo Gua was simply unfathomable, like a supreme god that controlled the truth of the grand Tao from the 9 heavens. Merely her aura was able to make the corpse fish feel how tiny it was, and it sensed what it lacked. Therefore, it was extremely respectful and looked forward to the Supreme being in front of it to accept it as a disciple. Luo Gui said with a smile, "I'm a mortal King Lingguo. If you can master this method, I'll accept you as a registered disciple." As she spoke, she pointed her finger. A spot of brilliance rushed out of her hand and went straight into the area between the human-faced fish's eyebrows. It turned into an extremely simple heart cultivation method that required a firm Tao heart to master. It was directly integrated into the human-faced fish's memory. The human-faced fish was quite intelligent. Otherwise, it would not have noticed Luo Guo's extraordinariness. After obtaining the memory, it was overjoyed and immediately bowed to her. However, when it lifted its head, it realized that his future master had disappeared without a trace. Everything around him had returned to the scene before his future master arrived. At this moment, it could not help but feel a little dazed. If it was not for the heart cultivation method in its memory, it would almost suspect that what it saw earlier was an illusion. Note: due to well-known reasons, the updates have been slow recently. Sorry. Chapter 732. Senior Sister. This spirit has an average aptitude. It only has a slight Taoist heart. Why do you want to accept it as your disciple? Lao Dan frowned and asked Luo Guo, who had disappeared into the void. Text first. Junior brother Lao Dan, don't you think that this spirit has the best aptitude and the strongest Taoist heart that we've met in the past 10,000 years? Luo Guo smiled and said, even so, it's just average. It doesn't meet the requirements to be accepted as a disciple. Lao Dan paused for a while and said helplessly, Junior brother, have you forgotten that I don't discriminate in my teachings? Luo Guo smiled. I see. It seems that Senior Sister has decided to lower the requirements for accepting disciples. Upon hearing Luo Guo's words, Lao Dan instantly figured out why Luo Guo said that. He could not help but sigh. Although the human-faced fish's aptitude was passable and he had a Tao heart, he was not that much stronger than the living beings they had encountered in the past 10,000 years. According to Luo Guo's previous request, she would at most impart some basic cultivation methods to a living being like this so that it could enter the Tao and cultivate. How could she possibly promise to take it in as a disciple? Although it would only be an in-name disciple, it was still an opportunity. It was an opportunity for it to become a true disciple and pass on her mantle. Compared to the many creatures that the three pure ones had encountered in the past 10,000 years, the fate of this human-faced fish was much better. You even accept a disciple with such aptitude. I'm afraid the number of registered disciples will reach an unimaginable level in the future. Luo Chunyang sighed. That's not necessarily the case. Isn't this human-faced fish the only one that barely meets the requirements in the entire Qing Zhou continent? Luo Guo said with a smile. That's the Qing Zhou continent. How can the situation of other continents be the same as the Qing Zhou continent? Even if the environment is the same, the creatures there will not be the same as the Qing Zhou continent when we arrive there in tens or hundreds of thousands of years. The number of creatures with good aptitude will be tens of millions of times more. Luo Chunyang shook his head and said, that makes sense, but it doesn't matter. So what if the number of registered disciples is unimaginable? As long as the number of direct disciples is controlled well, it will be fine. The more registered disciples there are, the more choices we have, Luo Guo said indifferently. It's up to you. Luo Chunyang sighed. As the three of them talked, they floated forward at the bottom of the sea without going to the surface. Even though the seawater was a bit of a hindrance to the three of them, it was not much. With their cultivation and cultivation, they only needed to think a bit, and they could directly isolate the resistance of the seawater. They felt no different from being on the surface of the sea or in the air. At this moment, the clouds condensed by the qi of malevolence, and the qi of the heaven and the qi of the heaven and earth. The clouds were faintly discernible. This light was faint and indistinct. Although it was at the bottom of the sea, it was not conspicuous. As long as one was more than 10 feet away, it would be difficult to see the existence of this light. The brilliance did not seem to be eye-catching, but it was extremely tough in nature, as if it was a real substance. It contained the nature of a ritual implement and could be controlled by them at will. It swayed slightly around their bodies and wandered at will, dispersing the seawater and creating a propulsion force that carried their bodies forward at a steady pace. After the great tribulation of the untainted world, the continents of the untainted world gave birth to countless creatures. The environment in the sea was similar to that of the continents. The living space in the sea was more three-dimensional. The number of creatures produced in the sea would only be more than that of the continents. Therefore, although the three of them were moving forward at the bottom of the sea, the world they saw was not lonely. Instead, it was colorful. It was not inferior to what they saw in the Qingzhou continent. The more they observed the world under the sea, the more Luo Chunyang and Lao Dan admired Luo Guo's idea of moving forward at the bottom of the sea. Compared to the Qingzhou continent, they were more likely to find disciples at the bottom of the sea. If they flew directly on the surface of the sea, they might miss the potential disciples. What do you think? It's not bad to walk at the bottom of the sea, right? Luo Guo was very proud when she saw the two of them looking happy. It's indeed not bad. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid we would have missed a wonderful world, Lao Dan said honestly. When Luo Chunyang heard this, he smiled and said, "However, I'm afraid that we will have to delay our arrival at our destination. It's better to postpone it," Luo Guo giggled. Indeed, Lao Dan also smiled. That's right, Luo Chunyang also smiled. The three of them looked at each other with smiles on their faces, appearing to be extremely happy. The sea in the untainted world was many times wider than those continents. If they took longer to arrive at their destination, it meant that the underwater world was more wonderful and rich, and they would gain more benefits. All of this meant that the effects of their travels were even more obvious. So how could they not feel happy and welcome about this? The three Qing Taoists left on their own. The human-faced fish was still in a trance at this time. After a long time, he came back to his senses. He looked into the sky and bowed. "Thank you, Master, for teaching me the technique. I will not let you down. I will cultivate this technique to the highest level and serve you as soon as possible." After bowing, he did not stay in the same place. He turned around and stirred the surrounding water. His body drilled down like an arrow, leaving a long whirlpool behind him. He quickly went to a reef below. As the seabed was still very close to the continent, the depth of the seabed was not very deep. It was only a few dozen miles. The pressure was not very great. At least, compared to the living beings of the primordial world, the pressure was not very great. Soon, the human-faced fish came to a huge cave in its lair. The entrance was only wide enough for the 3-foot cross-section of the human-faced fish to enter. The length of the human-faced fish was about 3 feet. Its body was shaped like a grass carp, but its face was that of a child. Although it still had the characteristics of a fish, it was vivid and lifelike. All its emotions were clearly displayed on its face. His aptitude was barely recognized by Luo Guo. She even thought that he was the creature with the best aptitude and the strongest Taoist heart in the entire Qing continent. Naturally, his strength was not ordinary. In this sea area with a radius of tens of thousands of miles, he was definitely a top-notch existence. Therefore, the size of the cave that he occupied was beyond imagination. The entire cave had a radius of tens of thousands of miles. It was filled with seawater. There is also a faint fluorescent light emitted from the surrounding walls, illuminating the entire cave. Chapter 733. The human-faced fish was in a depression in the deepest part of the cave that was just right for him to stretch out comfortably. With a thought, he sank into the depths of his memories and carefully comprehended the cultivation method that Luo Guo had poured into his memories. Text first. This cultivation method was a connate cultivation method that Luo Guo had created based on her own cultivation method. This technique was naturally far inferior to the Dao fruit Grand Dao, and it was even inferior to innate Grand Daos like the Soul Grand Dao. However, it possessed an extremely profound advantage, and it was that this technique absorbed the artificial spirit energy of the heavens and the earth. It relied on its own profundities to convert boundless artificial spirit energy of the heavens and the earth into innate spirit energy within the body, and then convert it into the energy required by the technique. Such a cultivation method had many more uses for the current primordial world. Moreover, in terms of profoundness alone, none of the various cultivation methods passed down in the primordial world could compare to this cultivation method. After all, the living beings who had survived the great tribulation of the world usually did not have high statuses, and their cultivation was not profound. How could the cultivation methods passed down by such existences compare to the cultivation methods extracted from the way of fruits of ways? As soon as the human-faced fish sank into the cultivation method, it felt its mind rise endlessly. In the blink of an eye, it completely lost all sense of the outside world. Even its body seemed to have suddenly disappeared. Its surroundings turned into nothingness. There was not even a speck of light. In this nothingness, the concept of the passage of time became more and more blurry to the human-faced fish. Gradually, it completely lost all sense of time. Time seemed to have become endlessly long, and its mind could not help but sink into an endless abyss. Under normal circumstances, the human-faced fish's mind would have collapsed long ago after entering such a state, and its soul would have disintegrated. However, at this moment, he could only feel that there was still a trace of clarity hidden deep in his mind. This bit of clarity was not enough to wake it up from the endless nothingness, but it could allow it to maintain the integrity of its mind and soul. It would not allow its mind to collapse and its soul to disintegrate in a state that normal living beings could not endure. However, that was all it could do. In this extremely dull state of nothingness, his every thought and thought became extremely slow. It was as if the appearance of every thought and the appearance of every thought required an endless amount of power and all of his strength. Under such circumstances, the distracting thoughts in his mind were infinitely reduced. All sorts of thoughts and ideas were gradually directed to his heart, to the source in the depths of his heart, and that was the deepening of his understanding of himself. As he delved deeper, he gradually discovered his true self and his true desires. After an unknown period of time, which felt like millions of years, the human-faced fish gradually broke free from that state. He slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were filled with an extremely clear, yet extremely ancient light. This kind of light was invisible and intangible. It illuminated his heart, indicating that his heart had undergone a tremendous change compared to before. With a slight struggle, crackling sounds rang out from his body. His human-faced fish body gradually broke apart during this process, and a brand new body gradually appeared from the broken body. The new body had 2 hands and 2 feet. It was clearly a human body. The proportions of the body were perfect. Every single muscle on the body rose and fell in accordance with some sort of supreme principle, allowing it to unleash all the power contained within the body perfectly. However, even though the body was a human, it was the body of a child around 7 or 8 years old. It was extremely compatible with the original appearance of the human-faced fish. It was as if this was the body that he was born with, and this was how he was supposed to look. It was as if the human-faced fish from before was merely a transition. The child was completely naked, and his sparse hair was draped behind his head. However, the light in his eyes did not make him seem young at all. Instead, he was like an old monster who had regained his youth. He was definitely not young and ignorant. Instead, he was extremely intelligent. It's a pity that I'm only at the beginner level. I'm still extremely far away from what teacher wants. The child heaved a long sigh, and an unwilling and regretful expression appeared on his face. That mental cultivation method could also absorb endless acquired origin chi of the world into one's body. After going through various reverting transformations, one would be able to refine a mysterious force of heart. This force of heart was similar to the power of one's spirit, but it was essentially like magic power. It was a power that existed within a cultivator's body and possessed boundless might. However, that was not the reason why the human-faced fish was able to refine its body into a human body after entering that mysterious state. In reality, the human-faced fish was only able to do this because its mental cultivation method had reached the beginner level and its mind had already reached a clear state. As such, it was barely able to completely control the power that it possessed. The human-faced fish had lived in this region of the sea for over 10,000 years. After such a long period of time, even if its aptitude was extremely poor, it would still be able to accumulate a considerable amount of power. Moreover, This human-faced fish was something that Luo Gua could barely take a liking to. Its aptitude was passable, and it was a living being with a decent mind. The power it had accumulated was naturally several dozen times, or even several hundred times more than that of a normal living being. It could almost be described as vast. If it could have perfect control over this power, it would have been able to refine its body a long time ago and produce a natural Dao body, allowing it to embark on a more perfect path of cultivation. The reason why it was still in that human-faced fish form was because it was unable to perfectly control its own power, and it did not know how to do so. After reaching the beginner level of the mental cultivation method, it was barely able to achieve perfect control over its own power. The mental cultivation method itself was developed from a segment of the Dao fruit. Even though it did not clearly explain how to refine the natural Dao body, cultivators would naturally be able to sense which form was the most perfect form to cultivate this method. It was only natural that it would be able to refine its body and produce this natural Dao body. It was precisely because of this that after breaking free from that state, the human-faced fish would naturally activate its power and produce this natural Dao body. Although this natural Dao body was not as perfect as the one that Luo Fan had refined in the past, it was already barely comparable to a human's body before the disaster of the world. This would bring endless benefits to the human-faced fish's cultivation in the future. The human-faced fish sighed for a long time. After stretching its body, it was just about to enter a state of cultivation again when a loud howl suddenly rang out in the distance. It shook the seawater, causing the seawater around it to tremble violently as if it was boiling. The human-faced fish frowned, and fury appeared on its face. That wolf shark king actually dares to cross the line. Chapter 734. Under such circumstances, he was unable to immediately cast aside everything in the past, unable to focus on the path of cultivation. As a result, he had the animal-like concept of territory from before. When he sensed that the so-called wolf shark king had stepped into his territory, the thought of immediately continuing to cultivate his heart in order to quickly cultivate his heart cultivation method to great success was instantly completely thrown away. With a thought, he stood up naked, twisted his body, and controlled the surrounding water to push him up, allowing his figure to shoot out of the huge cave like an arrow. Outside the cave, he raised his head and looked in a certain direction. Somewhere tens of thousands of miles away, there was a huge creature with a wolf's head and shark body that was 300 meters long. It was using its power to attack a certain part of the sea. What's there? Why is the wolf shark king attacking that place so fiercely? Although the human-faced fish was furious, it had already started cultivating its mind after all, so it still retained its rationality. When it saw the wolf shark king's appearance, an indescribable doubt arose in its heart. As the wolf shark king urged its power to bombard the empty seawater, it constantly let out shrill howls. The roar was filled with fury and hatred. It surged through the sea within tens of thousands of miles, making the seawater in this region seem to be boiling. Although this region was the human-faced fish's sphere of influence, it wasn't the only creature that existed here. In reality, there were billions and billions of different kinds of fish living in this region of the sea. However, even the strongest of them were far inferior to the human-faced fish. Hence, they could only rely on the human-faced fish to survive, occasionally becoming its food. But at this moment, under the wolf shark king's crazy roar, these creatures were dying in large swathes. Sound was actually a kind of fluctuation. When the sound reached a certain level, it could cause matter to disintegrate and life to collapse. To the human-headed fish, the wolf shark king's voice only made its body feel slightly numb. However, to ordinary creatures it was fatal. When the sound reached those creatures that weren't strong enough, they would be shaken by the fluctuation of the sound, directly disintegrating and naturally dying. Seeing this, the human-faced fish couldn't help but become even more furious. Although he didn't care about these many lives, they were still dependent on him and were also his food. How could he swallow this anger when they were suddenly killed by other living beings in such large numbers? Seeing this, he didn't care why the wolf shark king was acting so strangely. and he roared, "Wolf Shark King, go to hell." As he spoke, the water around him condensed and rippled, allowing his body to shoot madly towards the Wolf Shark King, who was tens of thousands of miles away at an unimaginable speed. Although the human-faced fish had amassed an almost boundless power in its 10,000 years of life, its cultivation level was extremely low. Even though it could barely control the power in its body, its cultivation level had only been pushed to the peak of qi refinement similar to Luo Chunyang's own cultivation method, and this cultivation level had barely caught up to the newly born Luo Chunyang. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to cross this distance of 10,000 miles, he could not cross it with just a thought like Luo Chunyang and the others. He still needed to go through a process. After a whole 15 minutes, the human-faced fish finally crossed the distance of several tens of thousands of miles and arrived before the Wolf Shark King. To Luo Chunyang and the others, this speed was obviously trash, but to the human-faced fish, it was a rather shocking speed. It made him rather satisfied, and could even be said to be rather proud of himself. However, at this moment, his heart was filled with anger. This kind of satisfaction and complacency did not make his complexion any better. He arrived before the Wolf Shark King and did not stop, charging towards the Wolf Shark King fiercely. The surrounding water suddenly condensed in this process, turning into a thin ring of light that encircled his body. As he charged towards the Wolf Shark King, the ring of light slashed towards the Wolf Shark King's body like a sharp blade. The Wolf Shark King seemed to have lost his mind. He just bombarded the empty seawater in front of him frantically. He didn't react to the human-headed fish's roar or his actions at all. It was as if the human-headed fish didn't exist at all. How could a human-faced fish care about the Wolf Shark King? The ring of light that was condensed from the seawater around him, that was like a sharp blade, slashed towards the Wolf Shark King's abdomen. A light cracking sound rang out. The Wolf Shark King's roar and movements turned sluggish. The blood red and madness that filled its eyes suddenly cleared up. He turned his head and looked at his abdomen. There he saw a strange creature that looked like a 7- or 8-year-old child leaning against his abdomen with a shoulder. Although his shoulder was leaning against his abdomen, there was a long crack that spanned across his entire abdomen. Judging from the width of the crack, it seemed like his body had been sliced into two. Scarlet blood gushed out from the crack, and the surrounding seawater was quickly dyed red. The figure of the 7- or 8-year-old child was also quickly covered by the scarlet blood, and could no longer be seen. At this moment, the Wolf Shark King finally understood what had happened. He roared, "Giant Fish King, how dare you attack this king?" The human-faced fish, who was also the Giant Fish King, coldly snorted. He circulated the power in his body, and the ring of light condensed from the water gathered at his shoulder. It elongated and pierced into the Wolf Shark King's body, madly cutting through the Wolf Shark King's muscles, organs, and bones. Although the Wolf Shark King's body had grown, its power was only on par with the original human-faced fish. Perhaps it could gain some advantage in battle by relying on its growth, but it definitely couldn't defeat the human-faced fish. After the human-headed fish had entered the rudiments of the mental cultivation method, although its strength did not increase, its control was countless times more exquisite than before. Its strength was naturally not something that the Wolf Shark King could compare to. How could the Wolf Shark King withstand the destruction of the human-headed fish when it was completely defenseless? In an instant, its life force was severed. A look of disbelief appeared in its eyes as it opened its mouth. Gurgling sounds came from within, but it could no longer make any sound. Its body twitched a few times before it stopped moving. Sensing the Wolf Shark King's life force gradually receding, the human-faced fish frowned. Why has the Wolf Shark King become so weak? Just as this thought flashed through its mind, an indescribable suction force suddenly appeared from where the Wolf Shark King had attacked. This suction force was extremely terrifying. Before the human-faced fish could react, it had directly sucked it in along with the Wolf Shark King's corpse. Chapter 735. The human-faced fish, known as the Giant Salamander King, felt as if the world was spinning, as if it had instantly changed to another world. Text first. When everything calmed down, He shook off the wolf shark king's body and looked around. He discovered that the feeling just now was not an illusion, but that he had indeed changed to another world. He saw that he was no longer at the bottom of the sea, but in an extremely mysterious small world. This world was hundreds of thousands of miles in circumference, and the sky was high and the ground was wide. He was on the highest mountain peak of this small world, and as he looked into the distance, the entire world was within his sight. Within the hundreds of thousands of miles of this world, there were all kinds of terrains: mountains, rivers, plains, hills, mountains, and lakes. Everything was similar to what he had seen in the prehistoric world. On this piece of land, there were countless creatures of all shapes and sizes. Even the most common types of grass looked different from what the human-faced fish had seen and heard of in the past. Although he could faintly distinguish some characteristics that he was familiar with, the overall situation was completely different. Where is this? The human-faced fish was indescribably shocked, and this was the only thought in his mind. After sensing slightly, the expression on his face became even more shocked. Although this chi is acquired chi of heaven and earth, is vastly different from the acquired chi of heaven and earth in the outside world. It actually seems to be the chi of heaven and earth from another world. The disbelief in the human-faced fish's eyes was almost tangible. At this moment, an extremely calm voice suddenly traveled into the human-faced fish's ears. He's actually already dead. What a pity. Following this voice, the human-faced fish felt as if his entire body was restrained by an indescribable power. Even the trembling of his muscles and the flow of power in his body were completely frozen under this power. It was as if he had suddenly become a dead object from the inside out, and his entire person had become a stone statue. What's going on? The human-faced fish was horrified. But it's fine. One died, but an even better one has come, the voice said again. As it spoke, a strange shadow gradually condensed in front of the human-faced fish. The shadow was faintly discernible, as if it was some sort of transparent, wondrous substance condensed from nothingness. It also seemed like a space, a form formed by the condensation of time and space. The shape of the shadow was very strange. It was roughly a human figure, but its hands were very long, its feet were very short, and its head was very big. Just by looking at its shadow, it looked like a big-headed gorilla. However, even though the shadow was shaped like a gorilla, it emitted an indescribably shocking aura as it stood there. This might shook the world, and when it appeared, the human-headed fish felt a chill surge up its heart. It was like the feeling it had when it had just been born and saw the human-headed fish's natural enemy from afar. It was as if it was an existence even lower than an ant before this shadow, and it was even unable to arouse a hint of will to resist. The shadow became more and more solid, more and more substantial. The shadow also gradually had all sorts of colors on it. There were all sorts of ups and downs, and after a short while, it had already turned into a strange creature. The creature looked like a big-headed gorilla, but in reality, it was like a normal-born Taoism physique. There was only hair on the top of its head, and other than that, it was no different from a normal-born Taoism physique. Moreover, its appearance was not much different from a born Taoism physique. However, it did not only have 2 ears on the side of its head. Instead, there were 3 ears on each side, and a total of 6 ears were embedded on the side of its head. The creature hovered in the air, and it was as if everything in the world was breathing with its breath, trembling with its thoughts, and changing according to its will. Even the origin chi of the world that filled the air, which was no weaker than that of the chaotic world, seemed to have a master at that moment. It surrounded the creature's body as if it was acting coquettishly, as if it was trying to curry favor with it. It was as if it was born along with it. The divine light in the creature's eyes was extremely cold, as if there was not a shred of emotion in them. It also seemed as if it was disdainful to show even a hint of emotion toward the human-headed fish. He looked at the human-headed fish as if he was looking at a piece of stone. The light in his eyes seemed to be that of a stone carving master analyzing what the stone could be sculpted into, and what methods could be used to make the stone carving into what he wanted. When a human-headed fish saw the creature clearly, the chill in its heart grew even colder. Although the figure's appearance was strange, it was only average compared to the myriad of strange living beings in the chaotic world. In fact, it could even be considered ordinary. Naturally, this was not what chilled the human-headed fish's heart. What chilled the human-headed fish was that the creature's appearance was completely different from the primordial world's most perfect Taoism physique, the innate Taoism physique. However, it did not seem awkward at all. Instead, it exuded a sense of perfection, a perfection that could not be changed or changed at all. This perfect body image resonated with the boundless heaven and earth essence chi in the surroundings. It seemed indescribably compatible. Even the innate Taoism physique that the human-headed fish had just transformed into seemed to become imperfect in the heaven and earth essence chi. It seemed extremely awkward, as if only by changing into the form of this creature would it be truly perfect. As soon as this feeling appeared, the human-headed fish, who had already mastered the heart cultivation method, instantly had a thought. This creature is definitely not a living being of the chaotic world. It was this thought that caused the human-headed fish to feel an incomparably cold chill. A sense of despair even surged into its heart. Although it was only a living being in the sea, and it had only lived for a short 10,000 years, it was still a king-level living being that occupied an area of the sea. It was a king-level living being that occupied an area of the sea after all. Its knowledge was naturally not something that the other living beings in the sea could compare to. If it were other living beings in the sea, they might not understand what it meant that this living being was not a living being of the primordial world. However, it had interacted with living beings on land before. It knew all sorts of legends on land and understood how vast the primordial world was. It also understood how difficult it was to enter the primordial world from outside the primordial world. Under such circumstances, how could the human-headed fish, who had already opened its mind, not understand that the living being who had spent a lot of effort to enter the primordial world had a huge desire? How could it not know that what this living being had said previously did not represent a beautiful fate for it? How could it not feel a chill in its heart? As for despair, it was even more likely to occur. The living being sized up the human-headed fish for a long time before finally moving. Chapter 736. He raised his hands and slowly extended them toward the human-faced fish. Text first. Within those hands, there was a mysterious, shapeless existence that was slowly condensing. This existence was extremely powerful, extremely refined, and extremely pure. It possessed unimaginable power, as if there were endless universes and endless worlds being created within it. The human-faced fish looked at those hands and knew that his final fate was about to arrive. The despair in his heart grew even more intense. Under the urging of this despair, the heart cultivation method that he had just learned suddenly emerged uncontrollably from the depths of his memories. It began to circulate wildly in his mind, and in an extremely mysterious way. The heart cultivation method was an extremely mysterious cultivation method, and it was also a kind of mental cultivation method. This kind of mental cultivation method essentially did not require the cooperation of the power within one's body. It could be circulated with only one's mind and will. It was precisely because of this that the human-faced fish could still circulate this heart cultivation method, even though the power within his body had been completely fixed inside out. He could still circulate this heart cultivation method and obtain unimaginable power from it. As the heart cultivation method circulated wildly, an indescribable power was instantly produced in his mind and will. It surged down abruptly and flowed throughout his entire body, directly merging with all the power within him. It instantly changed the nature of all the power in his body, causing the power that was originally just ordinary true power in his body to instantly turn into a power that could only be cultivated through the heart cultivation method. This heart cultivation method was extremely mysterious. Although it had substance, it was an existence that was close to idealism. Its wondrous use was close to freewheeling and omnipotent. Although it was far from the supernatural power cultivated through the Tao of fruits of Wei, it was definitely not something that the power cultivated through ordinary cultivation methods could compare to. At the very least, in the current untainted world, cultivators who could cultivate power that could compare to this heart cultivation method were as rare as phoenix feathers and Sheelan horns in the future. The appearance of this heart cultivation method unleashed an unimaginable power. His ability to resist against the power that was restricting the inside and outside of his body skyrocketed by an unknown number of times. Originally, the human-faced fish could not even move his muscles or cause the true power in his body to fluctuate slightly. However, under the urging of the heart cultivation method, he felt his body relax. The control over his body that he had originally completely lost returned in an instant. However, even though he had regained control of his body. However, he was still unable to move on his own. Instead, he felt as if hundreds of millions of mountains were pressing down on him from all directions. Although he could perform some limited activities, these activities could only be limited to his own body and could only be limited to subtle movements such as the vibration of his muscles. There was still a long way to go before he could truly move around freely. Although it was only a small improvement, the despair in the human-faced fish's heart had already been greatly reduced. A faint glimmer of hope gradually emerged. Under this hope, the nature of the heart force that filled his body began to undergo a subtle change. The power did not become stronger because of this, but became full of vitality. It had a terrifying, nourishing effect on his body, making him feel that his body's ability to withstand external forces had suddenly increased by who knew how many times. Under such an increase in endurance, the power of the outside world seemed to have weakened a lot to him. Thus, he finally broke through the restriction of restricting his movements within his body. His fingers finally moved imperceptibly, although it was just a slight movement. However, compared to before, it was already a qualitative difference. It allowed him to grow from a rock that could not resist to an ant. At this moment, the big-headed gorilla's expression finally changed for the first time. An expression that was close to shock appeared on the creature's face. As this expression of shock appeared, his hands also stopped moving forward. The supreme, powerful, pure, and wondrous existence that had condensed between his hands also began to slowly dissipate. I didn't expect such a weak creature to have such a profound cultivation method. Could it be that the cultivation civilization of this world has already developed to a mature stage? The creature muttered, as if he had fallen into some kind of hesitation. At this moment, the human-faced fish only felt the pressure on his body suddenly lessen. Although it still existed and was still restricting him, it was already within the range that he could bear. The decrease in pressure allowed him to slowly regain his rationality, and he gradually noticed something that he had not noticed before. From the beginning, he could completely understand the words that the big-headed gorilla-like creature had said. It was as if it was using the native language of the human-faced fish, which was also the common language used by all living beings in the primordial world. However, at this moment, after he regained his rationality, he discovered that the language that the big-headed gorilla-like creature was speaking was a language that he had never heard before. It was a language that was fundamentally different from the language spoken by all living beings in the primordial world. It could even be said that there was no connection at all, and it was almost at two completely different extremes. This language possessed all sorts of wondrous powers. It allowed anyone, even living beings that did not have complete intelligence, to be able to understand it and understand the boundless and rich meaning contained within it. It was precisely because of the mysterious power of this language that after listening to it for so long, the human-faced fish only now realized that this language was completely unfamiliar to him. It was a language that he had never heard before. In that case, I can't be so violent. The creature did not care about what the human-faced fish was thinking or what expression it had. It only continued to think about it. After a long while, it seemed to have thought it through clearly. It raised its head and said to the human-faced fish, I'm a cultivator from the great heaven primordial world, and I'm titled Human Venerable. It's a supreme blessing that you've met me today. As long as you swear loyalty to me, I'll pass on my cultivation technique to you, allowing you to possess supreme power and authority from then on. This human venerable was extraordinarily arrogant. He even placed himself above the primordial world. This could be seen from the fact that he wanted the human-faced fish to swear to him instead of the primordial world's supreme Tao. The human-faced fish could not help but be slightly taken aback when it heard the human venerable's words. After the human venerable finished speaking, the pressure on the human-faced fish instantly disappeared completely, as if it had never appeared. It made the human-faced fish feel extremely relaxed and at ease. It even felt that it had never lived as completely as it did now. After the human-faced fish underwent a transformation through the heart cultivation method, its intelligence was already more than 100 times better than before. It instantly understood why the pressure on its body had suddenly disappeared without a trace. It was clear that the so-called human venerable before it was extremely arrogant. He did not even deign to use pressure to force it to submit. He did not even deign to coerce an ant like it. To be continued. Chapter 737. This realization did not make the human-faced fish feel any sense of humiliation. Instead, it felt strangely relaxed. Text first. It was an unimaginable humiliation for any living being to be regarded as an ant that would not even bother to display its strength and exert pressure. However, it depended on the other party. If the other party was only slightly stronger than it, and it could even see its back, it would naturally be unacceptable. Any living being would feel extremely furious because of this. However, if the other party was so powerful that it was unimaginably powerful, to the extent that it felt like it was not even an ant when facing the other party, then it would only be natural and normal for the other party to view it that way. If it was a rational person, it would naturally not feel that kind of humiliation. Evidently, the human-faced fish might not have been rational before, but at this moment, after the transformation of its mind cultivation method, it had already become an extremely rational being. Naturally, it would not feel humiliated. As for the inexplicable sense of relaxation, that went without saying. Since the human venerable disdained using pressure to force it to submit, it naturally meant that there was a chance for it. How could it not be more relaxed than before when it was in complete despair? The human-faced fish had lived for over 10,000 years. The concept of the survival of the fittest had long been ingrained in its bones. Even if it received the mind cultivation method from Luo Gua, it would definitely not be able to change its mindset within a short period of time. It would not be able to turn it into a Taoist, a cultivator who wholeheartedly cultivated and comprehended the Tao. To it, although Luo Gua had done him a great favor and had given him a great opportunity to change his fate, they had only met once after all. After all, she had only imparted a cultivation method and granted him the identity of an unnamed disciple. It was naturally impossible to say that it had a deep relationship with Luo Gua as a master and disciple. Thus, when there was no pressure, it was naturally possible for it to revere Luo Gua, even if it was to worship and obey her every day. However, at this moment, it did not have the resolve to die in order to maintain its identity as Luo Gua's unnamed disciple in front of the human venerable who regarded it as less than an ant. As for the human venerable, he was not a living being of the primordial world. He would be betraying the primordial world if he sided with him. However, this was not a burden to the human-faced fish that had lived at the bottom of the sea for tens of thousands of years. Therefore, when the human sovereign finished speaking, the human-faced fish only hesitated for a moment before it knelt to the human sovereign and said, "Salamander swears to the Venerable One that I will be loyal to the Venerable One forever. If I betray you, I will die without a burial, and my soul will scatter." When a human sovereign saw the human-faced fish's reaction, there was no joy or satisfaction on his face. He was still as calm and cold as before. In his opinion, it was a matter of course for the human-faced fish to submit to him, so there was naturally nothing to be happy about or satisfied about. He didn't let the human-faced fish get up. and said directly, "Tell me what technique you cultivate." In the beginning, he'd changed his mind and asked the human-faced fish to submit to him because he was interested in the mental cultivation technique cultivated by the human-faced fish. Now that the human-faced fish had submitted to him, he naturally wouldn't hold back and directly started asking questions. As for why he needed the human-faced fish to personally tell him the mental cultivation technique, the reason was not complicated at all. After all, he was a cultivator from the so-called Great Tianyuan world. No matter how profound his cultivation was, the ways of the two worlds were different, the rules were different, and the laws were different. While he could see through some of the mysteries of the mental cultivation technique and could roughly deduce its overall appearance, it was relatively troublesome for him to deduce the true intricacies. As such, it was more convenient to ask directly. That was why he asked the question. If this had happened before, the human-faced fish would naturally have refused to divulge the mental cultivation technique. However, the situation was different now. Their relationship had changed a long time ago. So what right did he have to speak before the human sovereign? Therefore, though he was unwilling, he had no choice but to speak of the mental cultivation method in his memory without holding anything back. This heart cultivation technique was an extension and reconstruction of a technique that Luo Gua had extracted from the grand Tao of the Tao fruit. There is no need to mention how profound it was, and it even secretly conformed to some sort of profound law. This caused the world to respond to it as soon as it appeared in the primordial world, causing all sorts of mysterious phenomena to appear. However, in this miniature world, the mental cultivation technique was strongly rejected. Various sound waves naturally appeared in the air, interfering with the human-faced fish's voice. It made the crucial parts of the cultivation technique that the human-faced fish was saying blurry, making it difficult to identify. If it were not for the fact that the human exalt in this miniature world possessed absolute power, he would still be able to clearly grasp every single syllable that the human-faced fish had uttered despite being affected by the various ripples and sound waves in the surroundings. He would be able to receive the thoughts contained within the syllables and understand the profound principles contained within the words. I see. The human sovereign finally revealed a look of admiration for the first time after listening to the contents of the human-faced fish's explanation. After the admiration, a deep sense of doubt appeared in his eyes. However, this technique seems to be incomplete. It seems to be only a small part of a more profound technique. The human sovereign frowned slightly, his eyes flashing with the light of contemplation. Clearly, he was trying his best to deduce a more profound cultivation technique from the mental cultivation technique. However, this was clearly impossible. The mental mysteries of the fruit of ways were a cultivation technique that Luo Fan created through the endless memories of his later generations and the mysteries of Pan Gu's origin spirit. After countless improvements, its mental mysteries had even surpassed the limits of the primitive world. How could it be so easy to deduce? The human sovereign deduced for a long time, even causing the primordial chi, space, and time in this miniature world to madly change. It was as if the world had reversed and the chaos had been reopened. In the end, he could not deduce anything. He could only give up helplessly. Turning his head, he said to the human-faced fish, "Tell me how you obtained the mental cultivation technique." The human-headed fish had naturally witnessed the earth-shattering scene when a human sovereign was deducing the technique. It was shocked, and it had a deeper understanding of the human sovereign's power. The fear it felt towards him grew even stronger, so it didn't dare to hesitate. It first described how Luo Gua had appeared, how she had acted, how she had spoken, and what promise she had given it in great detail. Hearing this, the human sovereign frowned slightly, as if he was thinking about something that he could not decide on. The human-faced fish looked at the human sovereign, feeling very uneasy. Chapter 738. However, although he was nervous, his fate was completely in the hands of that human venerable. Even if he was filled with boundless fury, he could only endure it. Right now, all he could do was wait quietly. After a long while, The contemplative look in the human venerable's eyes gradually dissipated. He looked at the human-faced fish and said, "The first mission I'll give you is to temporarily forget everything that happened today. Continue to work hard and cultivate this technique to great success. In the end, become a disciple of that spiritual Guajinran and learn all of her cultivation techniques." The human-faced fish was slightly taken aback when he heard this, but he quickly reacted and bowed. "Understood." As soon as he finished speaking, the human venerable raised his hand and pointed. A speck of strange light rushed out from his finger, instantly traversing the void and rushing into the human-faced fish's forehead. This strange light was extremely profound and contained endless, inconceivable mysteries. However, it seemed to be incompatible with the human-faced fish's body and the power within it. There was some kind of essential difference. It was as if they belonged to two completely different systems, something that was molded by completely different rules and laws. After the speck of light entered the human-faced fish's forehead, the human-faced fish felt as if millions of kilometers of ocean had suddenly been squeezed into his body. An indescribable feeling of fullness and pain suddenly radiated from his forehead. He suddenly felt as if his entire body, mind, and soul were about to explode into countless pieces at any moment. He was in a state of no return. However, this was only a feeling, after all. Although it was incomparably painful, it was not truly injured. Its body and its power were still intact. In fact, its complexion even became rosier and healthier during this process. Amidst the boundless pain, the speck of strange light gradually enlarged. In the end, it illuminated its entire body, inside and out, and even entered the depths of its soul, producing bits and pieces of mysterious effects in its depths. During this process, the human-faced fish's memories slowly dissipated bit by bit. The divine light in its eyes became dazed. After the human venerable's strange light entered the human-faced fish's forehead, he casually waved his hand, and the human-faced fish's body suddenly shook. Then it turned incorporeal and disappeared from this small world in the blink of an eye. When it reappeared, it was in the sea where it had been before entering this small world. After a long time, the confusion in the human-faced fish's eyes gradually faded. Raising his head to look around, a look of doubt appeared in his eyes. Something seemed to have happened just now. Why don't I have any recollection of it? He frowned and pondered for a long time, but found that no matter how hard he tried, he could not remember what had just happened. Instead, as he gradually thought about it, the feeling of what had just happened gradually faded. If it wasn't for the fact that his heart cultivation method had undergone a qualitative transformation for some unknown reason and was many times more powerful than before he had an impression of it, causing his intelligence to be many times better than before, he might really have thought that the feeling of something happening just now was just an illusion. After a long time, the human-faced fish finally gave up trying to find the source of that feeling. It was not that he had accepted his fate. Instead, he knew that regardless of what had happened earlier, since he was unable to recall anything, it meant that there was either an extremely terrifying power that had isolated his memories, or a portion of his memories had been completely erased. Regardless of the reason, he was unable to touch it with his current strength. Therefore, he could only give up trying to find the source of his amnesia. No matter what the reason is, as long as my strength increases enough, there will come a time when I'll be able to find out. Such a thought flashed through his mind. He did not stop. With a sway of his body, he controlled the surrounding water with a much greater ease than before, moving his body at an unimaginable speed in the direction he had come from. After the human-faced fish had left, in that part of the sea, a strange human face was condensed from the seawater. That appearance was that of the human sovereign. The human face was extremely calm. Its eyes seemed to sweep in the direction that the human-faced fish had shot out from, intentionally or otherwise. After a long time, it disappeared without a trace. In the small world, the human sovereign's figure gradually dispersed after the human-faced fish had left. The extremely strange yuan qi in this part of the world also gradually dispersed, returning to the scene before the human-faced fish had arrived. It was still an ordinary holy land for cultivation. However, in the depths of this small world, beyond the range of the human-faced fish's senses, there was a location that was completely different from the others. That location was an incomparably deep abyss, a horizontal abyss, a cave at the foot of a spirit mountain that living beings would never be able to reach no matter how long they spent walking normally. This spirit mountain was the core of this small world. It was the most important and mysterious place in this world. This spirit mountain was not an ordinary mountain. Not only did it contain endless acquired yuan qi, it was also filled with endless connate yuan qi. However, the acquired yuan qi and connate yuan qi were vastly different from the acquired yuan qi and connate yuan qi in the primitive world. Although they belonged to the same category on a macroscopic level, they relied on completely different rules, laws, and great Tao. It was obvious that this yuan qi did not belong to the primitive world. Instead, it belonged to the acquired yuan qi and connate yuan qi of another world. Furthermore, according to what the human sovereign had said, it was extremely likely to be the yuan qi of the great Tianyuan world. The rules and laws that it corresponded to were the rules and laws of the great Tianyuan world. Only because of this would it be so strangely different from the yuan qi of the primitive world. On this spirit mountain, the human sovereign sat cross-legged at the peak of the mountain. He closed his eyes and cultivated. Outside his body, wisps of strange light swirled and twirled around him. Most of the innate yuan qi in the holy mountain had gathered around his body, constantly going in and out of his body, stretching and contracting, going in and out, as if he was constantly breathing and exhaling. In front of him, the void condensed, revealing the scene of the sea. Within it, a child was darting through the sea at an extremely fast speed. His speed surpassed the limits of any normal living being's vision, but he could not escape the coverage of the light and shadow. Even the slightest movement was displayed in the light and shadow without any hindrance. That was the image of the human-faced fish. The human sovereign had made the human-faced fish leave this place and return to the primitive world. Naturally, it was impossible that he did not make any preparations to control it. These light figures were the appearance of this control. However, his preparations were not to leave anything on the human-faced fish's body, but in its soul. In fact, nothing of his existence had been left inside or outside the body of the human-faced fish. No one, even Luo Gua, Luo Chunyang, and the others, could find any traces of the human sovereign on the human-faced fish's body. The reason why the human sovereign was able to completely grasp all the actions and conditions of the human-faced fish was not because of anything else, but because the human-faced fish had sworn allegiance to him. The great Tianyuan world was a big world. It had gone through 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth, and had undergone a fundamental transformation. The prosperity of the cultivation civilization had reached an unimaginable level. Compared to it, although it could not reach the level where sages could be seen everywhere in great Luo realm, could not be compared to dogs, it was 100 times, 1,000 times, or even 10,000 times more prosperous than the primitive world in myths and legends. This human sovereign was conferred the title of Venerable. In the great Tianyuan world, he was not an ordinary cultivator. He could also be considered a strong man. Although the so-called side was only a very, very small area, almost the size of a small city in Huaxia in the future, if his cultivation realm was translated into the cultivation realm of the primitive world, it was at least equivalent to the realm of becoming a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. In this realm, compared to all the cultivators of the primitive world, only Luo Fan could surpass him. In addition, Luo Fan's disciples, such as Hong Jun, Luo Fu, and Guang Pu, who had achieved Tai Tao fruit, were far inferior to this human sovereign. However, although he had such a profound cultivation realm, all his strength, all his cultivation, and all his cultivation had been cultivated in the great Tianyuan world. The rules, dharma, and great way of the great Tianyuan world had been deeply engraved into the depths of his bone marrow and engraved into the core of his soul. Under such circumstances, the rules, dharma, and supreme great way of the primitive world had an unimaginable repulsive force against him. It rejected his body, his power, his thoughts, and all his existence. Under such circumstances, unless he could change his dharma access and recultivate his Taoist law, as long as he stepped into the primitive world, he would encounter endless tribulations until all his existence was obliterated or all his cultivation, and power were completely erased. Of course, this was not absolute. Not all existences of other worlds would encounter endless tribulations when they stepped into the primitive world, until all traces of the outer world were eliminated. As long as a cultivator's cultivation realm could reach the peak of the Daoyuo Golden Tao and break through the limits of the world, he could easily analyze the rules, laws, and supreme great Tao of the primordial world and use them. He would naturally be able to use this mysterious power to analyze the world and refine his own cultivation technique. He would then change it and make it suitable for the primordial world. In the end, he would be able to fuse it into the cultivation world of the primordial world. This would naturally be able to eliminate this endless tribulation. But obviously, this Rinzun, who had just stepped into the golden path of the great all-embracing heaven, was only equivalent to a disbanded immortal of the great all-embracing heaven, or even a disbanded Tao of the great all-embracing heaven, and did not belong to that realm. He did not have the ability to analyze the rules and dharma of the primitive world, nor did he have the power to change the Taoist law that was deeply embedded in his bone marrow. Under such circumstances, how could this Rinzun dare to step into the primitive world? Naturally, he could only stay in this small world and did not dare to leave this world. If not for this, with Luo's current cultivation realm at the peak of the golden celestial realm, the distance between them was more than hundreds of millions of miles. Why would he need the help of this human-faced fish to have the opportunity to figure out the dharma access she cultivated? Why would he need the existence of this human-faced fish? Damn it! If it weren't for Crazy Lord's slanderous words, how could I have been sent to explore this newly discovered world? How could I have encountered such a depressing state now? The Rinzun suddenly shouted with an angry expression. As he shouted, the power in his body slightly rippled. The ripples of this power moved the threads around his body, instantly stirring the entire spirit mountain, causing the spiritual god to start shaking violently along with his shout. And the vibration of the spirit mountain spread out, causing the whole small world to start shaking violently. In an instant, the earth split open, the lake and river water all boiled, and large numbers of living creatures died and disappeared, as if they had never appeared. That tragic scene made people's hearts go cold. Only after a long time did the shaking disappear. The world slowly returned to how it was before, and many living creatures were gradually reborn. Just like before, they moved about in the small world as if nothing had happened. The Rinzun had already calmed down on the spirit mountain. He opened his eyes and looked at the projection that showed everything that the human-faced fish had experienced. His face no longer had the coldness and indifference he had when he faced the human-faced fish. Instead, it was filled with hatred, a boundless hatred towards a certain living creature in another world. No matter how angry, happy, or sad a normal person felt toward a rock or an ant, they would rarely show it before them. However, the situation was naturally different for a normal person. No matter how they tried to hide their anger, joy, and sadness, there would definitely be traces left behind. To the Rinzun, facing the human-faced fish was no different from facing a rock or an ant. However, facing the so-called Mad Exalt was a situation where he was facing his own kind. Naturally, his true thoughts would be revealed. Mad Exalt, there will be a day when you regret setting me up. This world may only be a perfect one, but it has an unimaginably prosperous cultivation civilization. As long as I can completely absorb the essence of the cultivation civilization here, I'll definitely make a huge breakthrough. Once I return, I'll definitely be 10,000 times more powerful than before. At that time, I'll definitely teach you a lesson." A vicious smile appeared on the Rinzuin's face. It was mixed with boundless hatred, making him seem extremely terrifying. As his expression changed, the spirit mountain changed as well. A pressure enveloped the spirit mountain, and then the entire world, causing it to become extremely stifling. In fact, many of the living creatures within seemed to have lost their ability to move, becoming dispirited. After a long time, the Rinzuin's emotions gradually returned to normal. He lowered his head. His eyes pierced through the layers of obstructions, and directly he saw the cave at the foot of the mountain. It was an incredibly deep, horizontal abyss. A wondrous aura seeped out from the abyss and slowly seeped into the spirit mountain, causing the spirit mountain to undergo a mysterious change. The nature of the spirit mountain became more and more pure and more mysterious. As time passed, the innate essence chi and the acquired essence chi that were different from the primordial world became more and more similar to the primordial world's essence chi. As time passed, it became more and more similar to the primordial world's essence chi. Looking at the cave, the Rinzuin's eyes were filled with helplessness, familiarity, and anticipation. It was as if he was looking at an extremely familiar hometown that he had no choice but to leave. In reality, the cave was none other than a passageway that led to the great Tianyuan world. However, the passageway was extremely unstable, extremely long, and extremely dangerous. It was impossible for anyone below the Grand Luo realm to pass through this passageway. This was because those below the Grand Luo realm would not be able to withstand the impact and pressure of the dangers within. After reaching the Grand Luo realm, the situation would be reversed. The more profound one's cultivation was, the more difficult it would be to pass through this passageway. This was because, unless one could restrain all forms of existence to the extreme, the more profound one's cultivation was, the more agitated the passageway would be, causing the dangers within to intensify and increasing the pressure on those who pass through it by millions of times. Therefore, only the existence of the disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven was the most suitable existence to pass through this passageway. However, even so, if 1,000 disbanded celestials of the great all-embracing heaven stepped into this passageway, in the end, only one would be able to safely pass through this passageway. From this, it could be seen how dangerous and mysterious this passageway was. From this, it could be seen that the Rinzuin was already incredibly lucky to be able to safely pass through this passageway. This passageway had a name. It was called the Bridge of Death. It was created by the sages of the great Tianyuan world. It was a bridge that connected two perfect worlds that were located in the boundless chaos. This Bridge of Death was extremely mysterious. It could directly cut through the chaos and, through some incredible means, connect the two perfect worlds together. It allowed cultivators who had not yet achieved the sage level and had not yet achieved the fruit of the origin way to travel between the two perfect worlds through this bridge. Although it could be seen from its name how dangerous this bridge was. After all, it gave living beings who had not yet become sages the possibility of going to another perfect world. The Rinzuin looked at the passageway, and the cordiality and expectation in his eyes slowly dissipated. After a long time, the cordiality and expectation gradually faded, and the look in his eyes became complicated. It was obvious that he was recalling the dangerous experience he had in this passageway for tens of thousands of years. The passageway connected a great world and a perfect world. The rules, and great Tao of the two worlds were completely different, and the flow of time was also completely different. These differences clashed with each other through the passageway, and naturally produced an unbelievable reaction, causing all the power, rules in the passageway to become extremely chaotic. As a result, the passageway became extremely dangerous. Although it was almost everywhere, fatal danger appeared at every moment. This Rinzun had walked through it, so one could imagine what he had experienced. How could he be indifferent to this passage? To be continued. Baidu, search bubble book read. Chapter 739. At this moment, the human-faced fish had already returned to its own cave. Due to his previous encounter, he was filled with the urge to increase his strength. With that thought, he did not want to waste any time at all. He directly sat down in the cave and closed his eyes to cultivate. The heart force born in his body began to circulate slowly in his body according to the requirements of the mental cultivation method. As the method circulated, the heart force in his body became refined and increased in an unimaginable way. Not only did it gradually fill up his body, but it also continuously refined his mind and his will. It allowed his intelligence to become more and more clear and complicated in the process. This was the most profound aspect of the mental cultivation method that Luo Guo had taught him. This kind of power that could temper one's mind and allow one's wisdom to become smooth along with one's cultivation. Although other cultivation methods also had a similar effect, they definitely couldn't achieve the same effect as this mental cultivation method. Almost all the power of the cultivation method itself was concentrated on this. As such, this mental cultivation method could be said to be a marvel in the primordial world's cultivation world. It possessed the ability to make all the cultivators who cultivated in the primordial world drool over it. It was precisely because of this that the mortal sovereign believed that the value of the human-faced fish was higher than he had expected for the cultivation method. As a result, he changed his mind several times. As the human-faced fish cultivated, he felt that he was becoming more and more real. It was as if he felt that he was living more realistically than he had been before at every moment. He understood himself more deeply than before at every moment. The feeling was so profound that the human-faced fish could not extricate himself from it. He could only hope that he would be immersed in that state of cultivation forever and never break away. Time slowly passed under such circumstances. Before he knew it, 1,000 years had passed. During these 1,000 years, the human-faced fish enjoyed the process of his state of existence deepening and becoming more real at every moment. It almost made him completely forget the memory that had disappeared 1,000 years ago. However, even though he felt that it was so wonderful and he could not extricate himself from it, the mental cultivation method that he cultivated had not even reached initial success. Compared to 1,000 years ago, he had made great progress. The heart force in his body was almost filled to the brim, and there was almost no space left. However, in terms of cultivation level, there was still not much improvement. Not to mention the great success of the heart cultivation method, he was far from reaching the small success stage. Under such circumstances, the human-faced fish was able to enjoy the fact that his body was becoming increasingly real and his essence was constantly improving. Naturally, he was quite satisfied. However, the human venerable hidden in a small world found it hard to be satisfied with his progress. To grand heavenly immortals, 1,000 years was not even a blink of an eye. However, that was when he could enjoy the fusion of the great Tao with the heaven and earth at every moment. His mind could soar amidst the boundless laws and rules. In this untainted land, the human venerable suffered from a boundless repulsive force at all times. His mind and mind were constantly under a pressure that could topple him at any time. How could 1,000 years be like a blink of an eye to him? To him, 1,000 years was like tens of millions of years in the great Tianyuan world. Under such circumstances, even though it was extremely rare for him to cultivate his mental cultivation method to such a level in 1,000 years and could be considered an unimaginable improvement, the human venerable was still extremely dissatisfied. He still felt that his cultivation speed was too slow. It was so slow that he could not stand it. With this mentality, one day he finally could not stand the human-faced fish's slow speed anymore. With a single thought, a thought directly charged out of his body. In an instant, it broke through the layers of barriers and enveloped the small world. Then, it seeped out of the small world and entered the untainted land. As a grand heavenly immortal, even the simplest and purest thought of the human venerable contained the great Tianyuan world's rules, laws, and even the mysteries of the great Tao. Under such circumstances, Even though he had restrained himself to the extreme, his thoughts still triggered an intense reaction from the untainted land. The sea that seemed to be connected to the small world surged in an instant. In the blink of an eye, endless tribulations were born. The calm sea within a radius of a few thousand kilometers underwent an earth-shattering change in the blink of an eye. It was as if it had turned into hell in an instant. This change was so intense that it caused all the seawater within a radius of several thousand miles to evaporate. Endless lava, earth fire, astral winds, and lightning filled the area. In an instant, countless living beings within a radius of a few thousand kilometers were completely wiped out and turned into nothingness. Amidst the boundless tribulations, the mortal venerable's formless will could no longer be concealed. It finally revealed its true form. It was like an eternal and inextinguishable brilliance, illuminating and suppressing everything in the boundless tribulations. No matter how many tribulations bombarded and attacked it, it did not waver in the slightest. It did not waver in the slightest. During this process, an increasingly powerful aura of perfection seeped out from the light. It gradually suppressed the surrounding sea, causing the tribulations in the sea to continuously disappear. Of course, although it continuously disappeared, the rate at which the tribulations were produced was very fast. No matter how much it disappeared, the tribulations would only become stronger and more terrifying. As the light endured the bombardment of the endless tribulations, it changed form. Gradually, it turned into a big-headed gorilla. It looked like the human venerable had personally arrived. When it was light, it seemed immovable and eternal. However, when it turned into a big-headed gorilla, it swayed in the wind and rain. It was like a shadow cast on a wall by a candle. It seemed illusory and swayed, as if it could be extinguished at any time. It could disappear at any time. As the world changed, the tribulations became more and more violent. In the blink of an eye, the area it enveloped shrank to a radius of 100 kilometers. Its strength increased by more than 100 times. It even caused the void lightning to tremble and reverberate within a radius of 100 kilometers. The big-headed gorilla formed by the human venerables revealed a pained expression. It did not dare to waste any more time. Its body shook, and it seemed to tear apart space and time. It shot towards a certain direction with an unimaginable momentum. That direction was none other than the direction of the human-faced fish's lair. If it was a zenith heaven immortal of the untainted land, no matter how it restrained itself, it would inevitably have some kind of resonance with the supreme great way of the untainted land. It would make any action or movement natural and perfect, incomparably harmonious and mysterious. It revealed a mysterious aura that was enough to make anyone who was not a zenith heaven immortal of the untainted land comprehend. However, this human venerable was not a zenith heaven immortal of the untainted land. He would not resonate with the supreme great way of the untainted land. Instead, he was constantly under the effect of the infinite repulsion force. Therefore, if he wanted to have all kinds of magical powers, he could only rely on his own strength and magical powers to forcibly break the void, break the time and space, break the rules, and use an incomparably brutal and unyielding method to suppress everything. In the end, he could barely achieve a feat similar to that of the zenith heaven immortal of the untainted land. As a result, every single step the gorilla took was going against the entire world. Coupled with the boundless tribulations in the surroundings, it was easy to imagine how powerful it was. After all, this human venerable was in existence at the level of a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. Although the situation was so bad for him, his thoughts were still able to rely on his own supreme magical powers to cross tens of thousands of miles at an unimaginable speed and easily rush into the human-faced fish's lair. The moment he rushed into the lair did not have the slightest ability to resist. It was directly annihilated by the endless tribulations brought about by his thoughts. It directly turned into nothingness, forming a spherical void with a circumference of 100 miles. If it were not for the fact that the human venerable did not want to destroy the human-faced fish during the process, he would have divided a bit of his power to protect the human-faced fish. Perhaps at this moment, the human-faced fish would have been completely obliterated by the endless tribulations. It would have died and its soul scattered. But even so, the human-faced fish could no longer maintain that state of cultivation. In just an instant, he felt that he had instantly fallen from the heavenly holy land of self-improvement into a boundless hell. The originally incomparably wonderful environment suddenly underwent earth-shaking changes. The whole world suddenly became a world shrouded in boundless tyrannical power. It was as if the end of the world had arrived in an instant. This change in the situation made it impossible for him to have any thoughts of investigating. He no longer had any thoughts of cultivation. In just an instant, he stimulated all the potential in his body. All the heart power, all the spirit, all the thoughts in his body were completely stimulated at this moment. All the supreme, defensive magical powers recorded in the mind cultivation method appeared in an instant. They directly covered his body inside and out, firmly blocking the endless tyrannical power attacks that were attacking him from all around. This endless tyrannical power was originally aimed at the great ways, rules, and dharma of another world. It was aimed at the existence of the great, all-embracing heaven. One could imagine how powerful it was. Even though it had been weakened by the human venerable many times, it was still an attack that the human-faced fish could not bear. In just an instant, the countless layers of defense that he had constructed were instantly torn apart by the boundless tribulations. His body was also bombarded by the boundless tribulations. Fortunately, these tribulations had been weakened layer by layer, and the epicenter was not on him. So even though he had suffered countless attacks from the tribulations, his body had only become damaged, and he had become like a ragged sack. He had not really been wiped out by the tribulations. Outsiders felt that he was very lucky when they looked at him, but the human-faced fish did not feel the same way. This was because at this moment, he felt that his body was being destroyed endlessly. He felt intense pain all over his body, and his mind and thoughts were constantly being attacked. A feeling of being close to death filled his entire mind. It was as if he could die at any moment, and it was as if his soul could collapse and be destroyed at any moment. This feeling of being on the verge of death was simply unbearable to him. He didn't even have the time to think about what was going on and why he would suddenly suffer such a fate. Only the incomparably pure will to live stubbornly occupied his entire mind, occupied all of his thoughts, causing him to activate his heart cultivation method and the heart force in his body like never before. The heart force was a power that was close to idealism. The stronger one's mind was, the more powerful one's heart force would be. When one's mind underwent a transformation, the quality of the heart force would naturally undergo a transformation as well. At this moment, there was only the pure will to survive in his heart, so his heart force naturally became pure as well, allowing his ability to survive to become unprecedentedly powerful. In an instant, his broken body was reborn rapidly under the effect of the heart force, recovering extremely quickly. However, the tribulations didn't stop because of his changes. Instead, they continued to bombard his body, destroying his body and wiping out his power. This formed a cycle with his heart force, a cycle of destruction. During this cycle, the human-faced fish felt intense, almost extreme agony, and amidst this agony, his will to live was tempered to an indescribable peak. All of his distracting thoughts were eliminated one by one under the endless pain. Following this, the countless impurities in his heart force were also removed bit by bit during this process. The removal of impurities was a metamorphosis for the heart force, a metamorphosis towards a higher realm. This metamorphosis was something that the human-faced fish did not know about, and could even be said to be something he dreamed of. Just as the human-faced fish entered the endless cycle of pain, the consciousness of the human sovereign furrowed his brows in dissatisfaction. His ability to comprehend is so poor. No wonder he can't master this technique after so long. It's a pity that I can't directly raise his realm. Otherwise, if I just use his power, he can instantly master it and reach the level where he can search for linguagenren. The human sovereign resisted the endless attacks of the tribulations while controlling the power of the tribulations so that it did not affect the human-faced fish too much. Naturally, he was not very happy. However, even though he was very unhappy, he was still rational. He knew that although he could directly use the human-faced fish's heart force to master the technique, he would definitely leave obvious traces in the fish's body. The traces were enough for anyone with a certain level of cultivation to easily see that someone had done something to the human-faced fish. This was something that he, who wanted to steal Ling Guozhenren's technique, did not want to see. That was why he was like this. Although he was extremely dissatisfied and impatient, he could only use the method of changing the environment to stimulate the human-faced fish's potential, so that the human-faced fish could raise its cultivation through its own cultivation. Time continued to pass during this process. In the blink of an eye, 7 days and 7 nights had passed. During these 7 days and 7 nights, the boundless tribulations grew stronger with every passing moment, and the area it covered also shrank with every passing moment. After 7 days and 7 nights, the area covered by the tribulations had shrunk to a radius of 300 meters. Compared to 7 days and 7 nights ago, the region enveloped by the boundless tribulations had turned into a state of chaos that was close to primal chaos. Even time and space had been slightly distorted. Matter and energy had become extremely chaotic, and it was enough to destroy all matter that existed naturally. The strengthening of the tribulations had almost reached the limits of what a human sovereign could endure. After all, he was only a sliver of his will. If it was his main body, he would be able to easily endure the tribulations, even if they were millions or billions of times more powerful. However, at this moment, the sliver of will was far from what his main body could endure. The power of the tribulations had already reached his limits. The sliver of will could no longer maintain the image of the human sovereign's main body. Instead, it had reverted to how it was when he had first entered the primordial world. It had turned into a seemingly unmoving and inextinguishable light, enduring the bombardment of the endless tribulations. Beside the light, the human-faced fish's body was like a ball of meat. It continuously twisted, and not only was it destroyed, it was also continuously growing. At this moment, the power of the tribulations he was enduring had become thousands of times more powerful than 7 days and 7 nights ago. Although he was in a much more miserable state compared to 7 days and 7 nights ago, his cultivation of the mental cultivation method was also many times more powerful than 7 days and 7 nights ago. At this moment, his mental strength had almost undergone a qualitative transformation compared to 7 days ago. Even in this extremely dangerous and wretched state, the mental strength he had cultivated with the help of the mental cultivation method had turned into a ball of light that wrapped around the ball of meat. It gave off a strange light of soul, revealing the deep traces of its existence to the outside world. Even the bombardment of the endless tribulations could only make it sway, but it could not truly destroy it. As for the human-faced fish, there was not a single thought in its mind. It was as if even its will to live had been reduced to nothingness. Although it was an extremely powerful existence, it seemed to have been engraved into its instincts, and it was difficult to find any trace of it. Finally, at a certain moment, the human sovereign suddenly had a thought. His senses swept past the ball of meat beside him, and he let out a long sigh. Is it finally done? After this sigh, the light that seemed to have existed for eternity and was eternally annihilated in the boundless tribulations. As the light was annihilated, the endless tribulations suddenly disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared in the first place. Baidu Search Book Bubble Reading. Chapter 740. The moment the boundless tribulations caused by the human sovereign's will disappeared, the mass of flesh and blood that the human-faced fish had transformed into suddenly trembled. In an instant, endless mysterious light was emitted from it, instantly enveloping a radius of several hundred kilometers. The light contained endless mysteries. It was a light that was completely different from all the other light that naturally existed in the primordial world. It was a light that reflected one's soul, a light that showed a certain state of mind and cultivation to the entire world and the entire universe. This kind of brilliance could not be described with color or luster. It was not fixed on a single characteristic. This brilliance seemed to contain endless types of characteristics, including everything in the universe. Moreover, it was constantly changing, with countless types of characteristics changing in every instant. The light was none other than the mental force that had almost condensed into substance and become extremely real. Under the light, the twisted mass of flesh and blood slowly twisted. Soon, it condensed into a child of about 10 years old. Looking at the child's appearance, it was the human-faced fish, the giant salamander king. After the child was formed, the wondrous light that had originally enveloped a radius of several hundred kilometers suddenly shrank back. In the blink of an eye, it shrank back into its body and directly disappeared into it. As the light disappeared, the human-faced fish's sense of existence skyrocketed by thousands of times. Floating in the void, it was as if a complete universe was slowly rotating within it. It was as if a star that emitted endless light and heat was fixed there. The human-faced fish slowly opened its tightly shut eyes, and there seemed to be an extremely profound brilliance flashing across them. Within that brilliance, it seemed as if all the changes in one's heart and thoughts were contained within it. So this is how initial success is. It seemed that after comprehending for a long time, the human-faced fish let out a sigh of relief and murmured. At this moment, his original nest had already completely disappeared. The place where the cave had originally been had turned into an area of nothingness that did not even exist in the seawater. Around his body, there was a spherical gap with a radius of hundreds of miles. Outside this gap, the endless seawater seemed to be blocked by an invisible force. It could only crazily press and collide outside, but could not invade the area within hundreds of miles. It was as if this area of several hundred miles was a forbidden area for seawater, and no seawater could invade this area. The reason for this wasn't because of how powerful the human-faced fish's abilities were, but because this place had just experienced the invasion of the boundless tribulations. The endless tribulations were unleashed by the primordial world against the great Tao, rules, and laws outside the primordial world. Although it appeared to be an attack of all kinds of violent energy, it was actually a reaction of the supreme, great Tao of the primordial world. It was an attack at the level of rules and laws. Naturally, this kind of attack would not only cause damage to the world on the surface. In fact, this kind of damage directly penetrated deep into the world, deep into the core of space and time. Under such circumstances, its effects naturally could not be easily eliminated. Therefore, at this time, although the boundless tribulations had subsided, the damage to the space, the impact on time, and the source of the existence of the sea had not been eliminated. There were still countless traces of violent energy remaining in this area of hundreds of miles. It was these traces that blocked the surrounding seawater and prevented the seawater from invading the area within a radius of hundreds of miles. Therefore, such a huge area of nothingness was created. Even the three pure ones, Luo Gua, Luo Chunyang, and Lao Dan, might not be able to see this change clearly, let alone the human-faced fish that had just barely mastered the heart cultivation method. Therefore, at this moment, the human-faced fish only felt surprised and incomprehensible. He felt an inexplicable chill in his heart, but he could not figure out what had happened just now from these traces. He frowned and thought to himself, "What happened just now? It seems like a kind of tribulation suddenly came." However, according to my teacher's records, cultivating the heart cultivation method will not encounter such intense tribulations. What exactly happened? He thought hard, but it was obvious that with his knowledge, he could not figure out the real answer at all. He could only helplessly enjoy the indescribable chill. However, after all, he had already mastered the heart cultivation method. His level of wisdom and understanding had improved a lot as compared to before. Therefore, he vaguely knew that the reason for the intense tribulations just now might be related to the memory that he had lost 1,000 years ago. Thus, after pondering bitterly to no avail, he understood a fact. That was, no matter how one looked at it, whether it was in terms of cultivation or the strange things he had encountered, continuing to stay here was already an extremely irrational decision. Since he had this feeling, there was no way the human-faced fish would dare to continue staying in this nest that had already disappeared. With a shudder, the heart power in his body changed automatically, forming a pair of fleshy wings around his body. They were like a pair of huge bat wings. With a slight flap, they brought his body up and charged into the seawater above him in an extremely domineering manner. He then stirred up the seawater crazily, producing an extremely powerful pushing force that brought his body up at an unimaginable speed. In just a short while, he had crossed a distance of several tens of thousands of li and charged out of the surface of the sea. Although the human-faced fish was a powerhouse that occupied a region of the sea and possessed power and remarkable abilities that ordinary marine creatures could not compare to, he was still a marine creature after all. Although he had some interactions with the creatures above the sea, this was the first time he had truly stepped out of the sea and into the sky. Now that he had left the sea, he was a little unaccustomed to it. He flapped his wings slightly, and his body shot out in all directions above the surface of the sea uncontrollably. After quite a while, he finally managed to grasp the method of flying in the sky with much difficulty, keeping his body stable. Only then did he have the mind to pay attention to the differences between the surface of the sea and the surface of the sea. There was no longer the endless pressure in the surroundings, and he no longer needed to go through a complicated process to absorb energy from the water. Instead, he only needed to take a slight breath, and energy would surge in. However, apart from these benefits, he also sensed that he did not have an advantage over the surface of the sea when compared to the surface of the sea. That was, although the pressure around him was gone, at the same time, there was also an endless amount of energy that he could draw upon. As an ocean creature with great power, after he got used to the endless pressure produced by the seawater, it had already become a kind of external power that he could borrow through various methods, allowing him to use this power to do almost anything he wanted to do. Right now, there was no seawater in the surroundings. This freed him from the pressure, but at the same time, it created an awkward situation where he was powerless to draw on. It was because of this that he had lost control of his body when he had just left the surface of the sea. What kind of life form is this? To have such a strange appearance. At this moment, a voice suddenly rang out in the human-faced fish's ears from above. The human-faced fish's heart jolted, and it raised its vigilance to the extreme as it raised its head to look up. There was a white cloud thousands of miles up in the sky. The cloud was extremely strange. Not only was it extremely close to the ground, but it was also as if it was stuck to the ground thousands of miles up in the sky. Furthermore, it was extremely realistic. It was different from the other clouds in nature. It was as if this was not a cloud, but a strange platform that was constructed like a cloud. After all, the human-faced fish had already attained initial success in his mental cultivation method. In terms of cultivation, he had already reached a realm similar to the divine fire realm. Because the method he cultivated was not a method of reversion, he was only one realm away from becoming an itinerant immortal. Although such a cultivation realm was not considered an expert in the primordial world at this moment, he was not considered an expert. However, he could barely be considered as having some ability to protect himself. His mind cultivation technique was also extremely exquisite. With a slight thought, his eyes naturally changed, and he directly saw through the essence of the cloud. He knew that the cloud was a miraculous artifact refined from the condensation of endless chi of heaven and earth using a miraculous method. Its function was to allow people to fly and transport ordinary items. This method was similar to his mental cultivation method, but the method recorded in his mental cultivation method was many times more profound than the method he was seeing right now. At the very least, if he wanted to condense a cloud, it would definitely not be as easy to see through as this cloud. A young man sat cross-legged on the cloud, looking at him with great interest. The human-faced fish was slightly taken aback when he saw the young man. He finally discovered the similarities and differences between the young man and himself. The similarity was that they were both in human form and had the appearance of natural Tao bodies. Apart from the fact that he had condensed flesh wings using his mental strength, while the young man did not, the biggest difference was that the young man was wearing a Taoist robe, while he was completely naked. The human-faced fish was very intelligent. The moment he saw the young man, he knew what he had overlooked. With a thought, the flesh wings on his back trembled slightly, and they turned back into mental strength. With another spin, they covered his body and condensed into a robe. A 10-year-old child dressed in a mature robe appeared where he was. When the young man saw the human-faced fish's changes, surprise and joy appeared in his eyes. It was as if he had seen something extremely rare but long-awaited happen right before his eyes. Before the human-faced fish could react, the cloud that the young man was sitting on suddenly shuddered. It changed its direction and rushed down at an extremely fast speed. In a short while, it covered a distance of several thousand kilometers and arrived directly in front of the human-faced fish. During this time, the young man also stood up. He stared at the human-faced fish with hesitation and anticipation in his eyes. "Who are you? Why are you looking at me like that?" The human-faced fish felt rather uncomfortable from the young man's stare, so he asked first, "You really can speak the primordial language?" The young man was overjoyed. If the human-faced fish still couldn't figure out what was going on, then he couldn't claim to be very intelligent. His eyes lit up, and he said, "Could it be that you've also been taught a technique by teacher?" When the young man heard this, he was overjoyed and couldn't help but laugh. "Ha ha, I finally found it. I finally found it. It's been 3,000 years. 3,000 years. I finally found teacher's path again. I finally have a chance to follow teacher." When a human-faced fish heard this, he couldn't help but smile. This person was indeed a cultivator that teacher Ling Gua had taught in the past. He could be considered a fellow disciple of the same sect. After cultivating arduously for 1,000 years, the human-faced fish couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity. He couldn't help but have a good impression of this young man. The young man vented for a long time before he calmed down. Since he already knew that this young man belonged to the same sect as him, the human-faced fish naturally wouldn't have any dissatisfaction. After a conversation, they both learned each other's names. Since the human-faced fish had already communicated with other cultivators, he naturally couldn't remain without a name. He couldn't keep being called King Salamander, so he directly gave himself a name, Exian. The young man naturally didn't need to give himself a name. Since he was a black tiger, his name was Taoist too. After exchanging names, they naturally communicated and roughly knew each other's experiences. Coincidentally, this Taoist, who was the living being that Shang-Qing immortal Luo Gua had tested when he was traveling around the Qingzhou continent. However, although this Taoist who had a decent aptitude, he didn't have much Tao heart. He only knew how to pursue power, didn't know how to cultivate and comprehend Tao, and didn't know the value of longevity. Therefore, Luo Gua only taught him some basic cultivation methods, and then gave him up. He didn't even have the hope of becoming an in-name disciple. Although it was a coincidence, it was also the most likely to happen. After all, Luo Gua claimed to teach everyone without discrimination. The living beings that she had tested must be the most among the three pure ones. The three pure ones' disciples that human-faced fish and Exian met were most likely from Luo Gua. Although this Taoist, who had no Tao heart, didn't know the true meaning of cultivation, and only knew how to pursue power, he had one advantage: loyalty and gratitude. Luo Gua taught him cultivation methods, gave him power, and allowed him to break away from the fate of an ordinary black tiger and become a cultivator. This was a great kindness to him. In Taoist whose heart, Luo Gua's status had already been elevated to an incredible level. Therefore, after raising his cultivation to the realm similar to Dan formation and barely qualified to travel in the untainted land, Taoist who left his home without hesitation and followed the path of the three pure ones. He wanted to catch up with Luo Guo, serve Luo Guo, and repay Luo Guo's kindness. However, his cultivation was low. Although Luo Guo and others walked slowly, their whereabouts were not something that Taoist who could grasp. After 3,000 years of stumbling and taking countless detours, he finally found Luo Guo's footprints 1,000 years ago. This was also the first time that Taoist who met a cultivator who was also Luo Guo's disciple in the past 3,000 years, so he could not help but be excited. When Taoist who left his home, although he was only at the realm similar to the Dan Formation realm, after walking in the primordial wasteland for 3,000 years, taking countless detours and encountering countless dangers, his potential was stimulated. At this time, he had already reached a realm similar to the divine fire realm, which was not the slightest bit inferior to the human-faced fish heart. As a result, his control over his emotions had reached an extremely fine level. He did not let his agitation affect his judgment. As he conversed with the human-faced fish, he easily found the difference between him and the human-faced fish from its words. I see. It seems that brother Exin is valued by the teacher. Taoist who sighed with great envy. However, although he was envious, he was not jealous at all. He did not reduce his respect for Luo Guo because of this fact, nor did he feel dissatisfied with the human-faced fish's Exin. Although he did not have much Taoist heart, he was quite open-minded and magnanimous. When he knew that the human-faced fish Exin was more favored than him, he did not think of the unfairness of fate or the unfairness of the teacher. Instead, he thought, since Exin is more favored than me, it must be easier for Exin to find a teacher than me. As long as I follow Exin, I may find a teacher. With this mentality, Taoist who sighed with emotion and said, since we are fellow disciples, why don't we travel together? If possible, we can find the teacher by the way. What do you think? Hearing this, the human-faced fish spirit was overjoyed. Anyway, he had no destination at this time, so it was naturally the best to travel with this fellow disciple. If he could meet his teacher in the process, of course, it couldn't be better. Therefore, he smiled and said, that's for the best. I hope Big Brother Tiger can take care of me in the future. I don't mention it. Brother Isin is a registered disciple appointed by the teacher. I need you to put in a good word for me in front of the teacher in the future. It's better for the teacher to accept me. Taoist who laughed and said. The human-faced fish also smiled. He only said that he would, but didn't say anything else. However, Taoist who did not dwell on this topic. After all, he knew that the human-faced fish was only a nominal disciple at best. Even if his status was higher than Taoist who's in front of Luo Guo, it was still limited. It was conceivable how much weight his words carried in front of Luo Guo. He was still not qualified to let Taoist who enter the sect. To be continued, Baidu Search Bubble Book Read. Chapter 741. After that day, the human-faced Yuisin and Taoist who traveled together, searching for traces of Shangqing Lingua Immortal in the vast sea area, trying hard to find him. However, it was obvious that their cultivation realm was at most equivalent to the divine fire realm. They were still far from the individual immortal realm of crossing disaster realm, and had not even achieved the immortal path. Compared with Luo Guo, who was at the peak of the golden immortal realm, they were tens of thousands of times weaker. Under such circumstances, even if the three pure ones did not intend to hide their footprints and just walked casually in the sea area, the traces they left behind were extremely obscure and could not be easily caught by the two. Therefore, it was not hard to imagine what the two of them gained. They definitely didn't gain anything. However, according to the original footprints of Taoist, they also got a rough direction. They knew that Shangqing Lingua Immortal was moving in the direction of another continent away from the Qingzhou continent. Therefore, although they could not find any traces of the three pure ones, the general direction was not wrong. In fact, they had been moving forward following the path of the three pure ones. In the blink of an eye, 10,000 years had passed. During these 10,000 years, the human-faced Yuisin and Taoist who had been moving forward in the vast sea area according to the direction they guessed. Fortunately, The human-faced Uisin was a sea creature. The vast sea area, which looked the same to land creatures, was not much different from land creatures. Almost every sea area was different from the others, and each sea area had its own characteristics. Under such circumstances, although they were walking in a vast sea area, the two of them did not get lost, nor did they feel that what they saw was monotonous and boring. On the contrary, in the process of walking, they saw the rich, colorful, mysterious, and unpredictable scenery of the untainted sea area and experienced countless shocks to their souls. What they saw and what they knew had been greatly improved, and this, reflected in them, made their souls undergo countless times of refinement, so that their cultivation realm was improved at an unimaginable speed. During these 10,000 years, because of his solid foundation, Taoist who had already raised his cultivation realm to the crossing disaster realm. Although he still had not reached the level of triggering the divine retribution, he was more than 100 times stronger than 10,000 years ago. Compared to him, the improvement of the human-faced fish will was enormous and important. Before Isin met Taoist who, he had just reached the basic level of the method of mind cultivation. It was only because of the weird fate and the strange loss of a small piece of memory that he left his original lair in a hurry, regardless of stabilizing his realm. Therefore, when he encountered Taoist who, his mental cultivation realm had not even stabilized at the initial stage of the cultivation method. After walking in the great desolate sea region for 10,000 years, not only did his will completely stabilize the initial realm of the technique, he had also seen countless sceneries that he had never seen before. The various natural scenes and the battles between living beings had caused his heart to surge. His strength of heart had greatly increased, and he had faintly touched the edge of the next realm. Under such circumstances, although his cultivation realm was still at the divine fire realm, because of the mystery of the method of mind cultivation, the power of his divine ability had firmly suppressed Taoist who was at the crossing disaster realm. The method of mind cultivation was an extremely exquisite cultivation method. It was unimaginably difficult to cultivate. Back then, the human-faced fish Wilhart had spent 1,000 years, but he had only managed to raise the initial realm to completely stabilize it. It was only by relying on the endless tribulations brought by the human sovereign that his heart was stirred enough, and thus his method of mind cultivation achieved initial success. Obviously, for any method, there was an extremely huge leap from small mastery to great mastery. The difficulty of cultivation was definitely far greater than from entry to small mastery, or even tens of thousands of times. Under such circumstances, to be able to cultivate the method of mind cultivation from small mastery to the great mastery in just 10,000 years, this speed of progress was definitely more than 1,000 times the normal speed, and it was enough to make Thou proud. The fundamental reason for this was the nature of the method of mind cultivation. The method of mind cultivation created by Luogwa was different from other cultivation methods, not only because it was derived from a small part of the way of Tao fruit, but also because this method of mind cultivation was completely aimed at the mind. As long as the mind was improved, the realm of the method of mind cultivation would naturally be improved, no matter how great the improvement was. This allowed this method of mind cultivation to transcend the limitations of time to a certain extent. It was not like other cultivation methods, where even if one reached the realm, he needed to spend a certain number of years to accumulate power and push his own power to the scale corresponding to the realm. For this method of mind cultivation, the power of the heart was directly linked to the realm of the mind. As long as the realm of the mind was broken through, his power of the heart would naturally be broken through, and he did not need to spend much time to accumulate the power of the heart. Of course, this did not mean that the method of mind cultivation could only be improved through the improvement of the realm of the mind. In reality, this method of mind cultivation could also use the methods of ordinary cultivation methods to advance the amount of power of the heart through the accumulation of time, and thus improve the realm of this method from the outside to the inside. This was also the reason why he was able to advance this method from a beginner state to a rather profound realm when he cultivated behind closed doors in his own nest. Otherwise, how could he improve the realm of his mind by cultivating behind closed doors? How could he improve the realm of this method? On this day, the two of them arrived on an island in a certain sea region. They landed, and both of them revealed slightly tired expressions. One of them was a sea creature, and the other had raised his cultivation to the tribulation crossing realm. He was only a small step away from achieving immortality. Walking in the sea naturally did not pose much pressure to them, and it was not enough for their bodies or their power to reach an unbearable level. However, at this moment, they could not help but reveal these tired expressions. They did not feel tired physically or in terms of power. What made them feel tired was the impossibility of achieving their original goal, the impossibility that was close to despair. At this moment, it had been 4,000 years since they last found the traces left behind by Luogwa. Aside from seeing a creature that had been tested by perfected master Shangxing Lingua 4,000 years ago and received an extremely simple cultivation method, in these 4,000 years, they had traversed who knew how many millions of miles of the sea region, but they had not encountered any cultivators with that familiar scent. It was as if they had found the wrong direction, and that perfected master, Shangxing Lingua, was not heading in this direction. This mental pressure of not knowing if they were walking on the right path was what made the two of them feel tired. The two of them landed on the island and did not do anything else. They directly chose a place to sit down and take shelter from the wind and rain. They closed their eyes and began to adjust their breathing. Not long after they closed their eyes and adjusted their breathing, a storm appeared in the sea region. The storm stirred up the endless seawater and raised countless waves, causing the originally calm sea surface to suddenly become violet, as if the sea had suddenly become angry. This was the reason why the two of them landed on the island, to find shelter from the wind and rain. Although their divine sense could shield them from the impact of the storm, it was not a good thing after all. If possible, they naturally did not want to travel in such weather. After a long time, Isin and Taoist who finished adjusting their breathing. They looked at each other and sighed. "Brother Isin, is there really no trace left by the teacher in this sea region?" Taoist who still did not give up and asked after a sigh. "No." Isin sighed and said, "Alas, if this goes on, I'm afraid I really can't hold on for long." Taoist who paused for a long time and then sighed helplessly. After all, Isin was a method of mental cultivation. He originally had a strong Taoist heart, so he was more determined than Taoist who. Seeing that Taoist who was a little dispirited, Isin said, "Brother Hu, why are you so discouraged? Although we still can't find the trace left by the teacher, we have made great progress along the way. Isn't this good? If we can't find the teacher, no matter how strong our cultivation is, what's the use?" Taoist who did not agree with this and still sighed. From this, one could see the gap between Taoist who and Isin's Taoist heart. For Isin, although it was important to find his teacher, immortal Shangxing Lingua, his own cultivation and achievements were even more important. Even if he did not find his teacher, as long as he could cultivate to immortality and go far on the road of Tao, he would only feel a little regret, but he would still be satisfied on the whole. But for Taoist who, his purpose was completely different from Isin's. To him, finding his teacher, serving by his teacher's side, and doing his best to repay his teacher's kindness was the most important thing to him. Compared to this, power, cultivation, and longevity were all secondary. They were just a means to achieve this goal. As long as he did not find his teacher, no matter how great his achievements were or how powerful his divine abilities were, he would feel that it was a huge failure. He would feel that his life was completely meaningless. Although Isin was not satisfied with Taoist who's answer, he also knew that this was Taoist who's real idea. Even if he said it out loud, he would never be able to change it. He could only say helplessly, "Brother Hu, you are wrong. As long as our cultivation is getting more and more profound, one day we will be strong enough to find the teacher." "I know, but I'm not happy if I don't find the teacher," Taoist who said helplessly. Hearing this, Isin could only sigh. A thought that had appeared many times before appeared in his mind again. No wonder the teacher gave up Brother Tiger and was not even willing to give him the promise of a nominal disciple. With Brother Tiger's mentality, he might have made considerable progress before he found the teacher. If he stayed by the teacher's side, his cultivation would definitely stagnate, and it would be difficult for him to make any progress. While Eason was still sighing with Taoist whose mentality, somewhere in the sea area on the edge of the Qingzhou continent, in a small world attached to this location, there was also a creature who was very dissatisfied with Eason's progress. This creature was none other than Human Venerable. At this time, Human Venerable was still on the spirit mountain in the core of this small world. He sat cross-legged and looked straight at the light and shadow that appeared in front of him. In the light and shadow, the scenes around the human-faced Eason and Taoist who appeared. This human sovereign didn't look any different from 10,000 years ago. His aura was still astonishing, and he was still mysterious and unfathomable. However, his eyes were full of a kind of anxiety that had not been there for 10,000 years. This anxiety affected the entire small world, making it seem as if the entire small world was being suppressed by some kind of existence that blotted out the sky and the sun. It seemed as if there would be an unimaginable power erupting at any moment and completely annihilating everything in the small world, causing the small world to return to chaos. Since he helped the human-faced fish to refine its mind and made it reach the basic level of mind cultivation method 10,000 years ago, Human Venerable had never once interfered with the untainted land, the actions of the human-faced fish Eason, and everything that happened to it. The reason for this was that, in addition to the fact that he did not want to leave traces on the human-faced fish with too much interference, the most important thing was that the interference had brought him unimaginably serious consequences. During that interference, Human Venerable did not do much. He just sent a little bit of his mind into the untainted land and triggered endless tribulations to bombard the human-faced fish Eason. Thus, the Eason's mind and spirit were endlessly refined and directly pushed his mind cultivation method to the basic level. In his opinion, the interference was extremely small. The impact on him should only cause him to lose a little bit of his will. To him, a little bit of will could naturally be recovered with a slight thought and a slight rotation of his soul. From this point of view, even the loss of that bit of will could not be considered a loss. It was precisely because of this that he stopped enduring after enduring for 1,000 years. He directly used that violent method to help the human-faced fish Eason's cultivation method improve. However, he had underestimated the primordial world and the intense reaction of the primordial world. After he achieved his goal and gave up on that bit of will and eliminated the endless tribulations that the human-faced fish Eason had endured, the primordial world did not stop rejecting him. Instead, through the extremely subtle and mysterious connection between his will and his main body, he used some unbelievable method to pass through the layers of space-time and directly acted on the small world, causing the small world he was in to instantly suffer an endless bombardment of power. This kind of power bombardment was the effect of the primordial world on the small world. Although the connection between the will and the main body was extremely obscure, subtle, and mysterious, the repulsive force could not completely descend on the small world and the Human Venerable's body. The impact of this power was not strong. It was not the entire primordial world crushing the small world. Instead, it was like a wave that affected the small world. After a wave of power blasted into the small world, it stopped. However, the consequences would be unimaginably huge. That power was, after all, the power of the world. It was emitted directly by the supreme great Tao of the primordial world, and it possessed all sorts of incredible characteristics. As soon as it entered the pocket world, it naturally condensed into a source of power. Countless miraculous tribulations bombarded the pocket world at every moment, intending to completely erase the existence of the pocket world and destroy into a chaotic state. Although this small world seemed to be very, very small, almost insignificant compared to the whole untainted land, it was an extremely important existence for Human Zune. This small world was the basis for his existence in the untainted land. It was precisely because of the existence of this small world that human Zune could exist in the untainted land as a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven from another big world. It was also because of the existence of this small world that human Zune could exist in the untainted land as a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven from another big world. Only then could he ensure that he would not be killed by the endless tribulations triggered by the violent reaction of the untainted land. It was precisely because of this that when the power of the untainted land invaded the pocket world and formed the endless tribulations of the pocket world, which were about to completely erase the pocket world, human Zune finally developed a sense of panic. He didn't dare to treat it lightly. He directly put aside his concern for the human-faced fish and tried hard to control the power of the pocket world to confront the endless tribulations of the pocket world. Although the power of the untainted land that bombarded the pocket world was only a wave, it was, after all, a power that targeted a part of the world. Naturally, it was countless times more powerful than the endless tribulations that human Zune had encountered in the untainted land. Even with the cultivation of human Zune as a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven, it took him nearly 5,000 years to barely erase that power and eliminate the root cause of the destruction of the pocket world. Even after erasing that power, it still took him thousands of years until recently to completely erase the traces of the existence of that power and completely repair the countless damages suffered by the pocket world. This allowed the pocket world to return to its state before it encountered the tribulations, and with great difficulty, he restored the pocket world to its original state before it encountered the tribulations. Come to think of it, the price that human Zune had paid to help the human-faced fish cultivate the heart cultivation method to the small success level was far beyond what he could bear. It could absolutely be said that the gains did not make up for the losses. Because of this, in the past 10,000 years, even if he was dissatisfied with the cultivation of the human-faced fish's heart cultivation method, he didn't dare to easily interfere. He could only rely on the light and shadow that appeared in front of him in this pocket world to complain on the side. Baidu Search Bubble Book Reading. Chapter 742. After 10,000 years, he has only made such little progress. No wonder he only made a promise to an unnamed disciple. If it were up to me, I would definitely not even make a promise to an unnamed disciple. The Venerable looked at the light and murmured. The price of interfering with the cultivation of the human-faced fish heart was extremely huge, so he did not dare to act rashly. However, seeing that his only way to find the Shangqing Ling Guozhenren and obtain his cultivation method to explore the mysteries of cultivation in the untainted land was progressing so slowly, he could not help but feel resentful. The most important point was that in this small world, he was really depressed. It was a world of difference from his experience in the great Tianyuan world. It made him feel an unbearable lack of freedom. He felt that staying in it for a second was tens of thousands of times longer than real time. Because of this, he became more and more dissatisfied with the human-faced fish heart's cultivation progress, which was not bad under normal circumstances. Sitting there with his legs crossed, the Venerable's eyes showed a slight struggle. The cultivation of the mind seemed to be a process of advancing step by step towards an unpredictable peak. It was filled with endless difficulties and endless mysteries. But to a human venerable, his cultivation was just like climbing a small mound of soil. Any twists and turns, any dangers that might be encountered in it were all clear to him. There was no mystery to it. As a result, it was extremely difficult for the mind to cultivate the mental cultivation method to greater mastery. In fact, it could only be achieved by luck. However, for a human venerable, he only needed a thought to make the mind cultivate the mental cultivation method to greater mastery. At this time, what the venerable was considering was whether he should intervene. According to the cultivation method and speed of the human-faced fish heart, the time needed to wait for the mind cultivation method to the great accomplishment realm was almost unpredictable. Perhaps in the next moment, he would encounter something that would greatly agitate his spirit, or perhaps he would encounter some great opportunity that would directly activate his cultivation method. allowing his cultivation method to reach great success. Or perhaps he would continue like this without any ripples, and in the end, when his lifespan was exhausted, he would die and his Tao would vanish, and he would not be able to reach great success. At this time, in the untainted land, although the acquired qi of heaven and earth had replaced most of the innate qi of heaven and earth, there is still an extremely large amount of innate qi of heaven and earth. In this state, even an ordinary creature would absorb some innate qi of heaven and earth into its body every time it breathed, and then replenish some of the body's consumption due to survival. This would greatly extend its own life, so that it could live for several times, dozens, or even hundreds of times longer than its normal life. Even ordinary creatures were like this, let alone cultivators. Cultivators themselves were existences that attracted the outside world's qi into their bodies. Naturally, their utilization of innate qi of qi was far higher than ordinary creatures. In this case, even if cultivators did not reach the individual immortal realm, their lifespan would be extended to an innate qi of innate qi. A lifespan that is thousands or tens of thousands of times longer than normal is simply child's play. If it was on the human-faced fish heart, the situation would be even more difficult to say. The cultivation method of the heart was obtained from the perfected luo fruit of shangqingling fruit. Its origin was the great Tao of the Tao that even innate gods dreamed of. Its utilization of innate qi of heaven and earth was absolutely the highest in the untainted land. It could almost be said to be the best in the untainted land since ancient times. In this way, even if the human-faced fish heart had not yet obtained the ability of immortality, the amount of time it could live in the world was almost no different from immortality. Millions of years, tens of millions of years, or even hundreds of millions of years, as long as its soul could bear it, it could continue to live. It was because of this understanding that the human sovereign did not have much confidence in the cultivation of the human-faced fish heart. He even felt that if he did not care about it, he might never be able to cultivate the heart cultivation method to completion. If this continues, how long do I have to wait? Do I have to spend endless time to comprehend the laws of the great Tao of this world? How long do I have to wait? The human sovereign frowned and thought to himself, there was great terror between life and death. This kind of terror was a great motivation for any living creature. For the heart, the motivation was thousands of times greater than that of ordinary living creatures. This was because the mental cultivation method that Xin cultivated was aimed at the mind and the will. With an almost endless lifespan, without the great terror between life and death, his mind and his will had lost one of its greatest motivations. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to cultivate this mental cultivation method to large success, it would be countless times more difficult for him to achieve great success in this mental cultivation method. Slowly waiting for the heart to cultivate on its own, the human sovereign did not feel that he had enough patience. He even had a feeling that if he waited for the heart to cultivate the heart cultivation method to completion, it would be better to rely on his own outstanding wisdom to comprehend the supreme great Tao of the untainted land and deduce the true meaning of cultivation behind the heart cultivation method. But this was just a thought. The human sovereign still had considerable self-awareness. Although he had become a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven, that was achieved with the help of the endless accumulation of time. His own qualifications and his own wisdom were not strong enough to defy the natural order. Seriously speaking, he was only a little stronger than ordinary cultivators. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to get rid of the deep influence of the rules, laws, and great Tao of the great Tianyuan world to comprehend the mysteries of cultivation in the untainted land, and it would be difficult to achieve anything without hundreds of millions of years. And he felt that even 1,000 or 10,000 years was unbearable. How could he accept hundreds of millions of years to comprehend the mysteries of cultivation in the untainted land in exchange for the possibility of accomplishing his goal? So, after thinking it over, the human sovereign helplessly found that as long as he wanted to accomplish his goal of coming to the untainted land as soon as possible and accomplish his goal of conquering the untainted land, he could only choose to help the heart cultivation method of the human-faced fish. Of course, there might also be a kind of dissatisfaction in it. It was a kind of dissatisfaction with the power of the untainted land. Why did it take him nearly 10,000 years to completely dispel the influence of just a little bit of the power of the untainted land into the small world and restore the original landscape of the small world? It should be known that this small world was completely constructed with the power of the great Tianyuan world. It could even be said that it was an extension of the great Tianyuan world. Although it was only a subtle projection across an unknown amount of space, its own power was also earth-shattering. Its essence was by no means comparable to that of the small, untainted land. Under such circumstances, the bombardment of a little power of the untainted land had actually made him so embarrassed. No matter how he looked at it, it was difficult for him to accept. It was under this kind of dissatisfaction that the human sovereign was inclined to think more seriously about the consequences of not interfering with the heart cultivation of the human-faced fish, and finally came to the above conclusion. Now that he had made up his mind, the human sovereign began to make all kinds of preparations. Although he was dissatisfied in his heart and didn't think that the power of the untainted land could really make him unable to resist, he also knew that if he interfered with the untainted land, it would inevitably cause a violent reaction from the untainted land. It would inevitably lead to the bombardment of infinite power, resulting in earth-shattering consequences. Naturally, he needed to make all kinds of preparations to deal with it carefully. Having the fighting spirit in his heart didn't mean that he had to act recklessly. With a slight thought, the spirit mountain below him trembled. Endless mysterious brilliance erupted from the depths of the spirit mountain, directly penetrating the thick mountain rocks, passing through the barrier of the void and illuminating the entire small world, causing the entire small world to seem to become a transparent shadow at this moment. Under this transparent shadow, mysterious and strange threads crisscrossed, weaving a huge three-dimensional network that controlled all the operation of laws in the small world and all the transformation of time and space. The spiritual mountain he was sitting on also became almost transparent during this process. Only at the core, there was a strange wheel-shaped object slowly rotating. The endless mysterious brilliance was emitted during the mysterious rotation, illuminating the entire small world. At the same time, in the deep cave at the bottom of the spirited mountain, waves of mysterious waves were spurted out by an indescribable force. Through an unimaginable method, they twisted and crashed into the huge wheel at the core of the spirited mountain. As a result, the light emitted from the wheel became even more dazzling and dense. Under the brilliance, the three-dimensional network that covered the entire small world was slightly stirred. Its structure produced an extremely subtle and extremely mysterious change. It vaguely produced a kind of direction from every inch of the void in the small world to the hidden core of the small world, the cave at the foot of the spirit mountain, where the mysterious fluctuations were coming from. Although this change was subtle and indescribable, the effect was extremely obvious. In the blink of an eye, the aura contained in the small world that was incompatible with the untainted land skyrocketed by an unknown number of times. The real degree of the human sovereign in this place increased by an unknown number of times. After doing all this, the human sovereign let out a long breath and slowly relaxed. As he relaxed, the light gradually faded, the spirit mountain returned to normal, and the small world also returned to its original appearance. However, only he knew that the essence of the miniature world had undergone a huge change. At this moment, the existence of the miniature world had been greatly reduced. From a certain point of view, it had even become a part of the passageway, a place of transition. As a result, as soon as any external force or matter entered this small world, they would first rush into the passageway and be directly devoured by the passageway. They would no longer be able to stay in this small world and destroy it. No matter how strong the power of the world is only a perfect world after all. Its nature is tens of thousands of times weaker than that of the great world of Tianyuan. If I guide its power into the passage, it is equivalent to letting the power of the great world of Tianyuan kill it directly. I can definitely win. The human sovereign thought to himself. After making the most perfect preparation, the human sovereign no longer hesitated. He directly fixed his eyes on the figures of the human-faced fish heart and Taoist who that appeared in front of him. After all, he was rejected by the entire untainted land. Even if a little thought entered it, it would cause endless tribulations until the existence of that thought was erased. Therefore, his perception naturally could not extend into the untainted land. Because of this, all his perception of the untainted land could only be seen and perceived by the human-faced fish heart that he had sworn to. He could only see and perceive the untainted land through his body, his thoughts, and his perception. Therefore, it could be said that he could only perceive what the human-faced fish heart could perceive. What the human-faced fish heart could not see or perceive, he might be able to deduce through his own strong cultivation and incredible divine sense. But it was absolutely impossible for it to exist without a source. It was impossible for it to exist completely outside the limits of the fish heart's perception. This was also the reason why he relied so much on the fish heart, and why he could only find ways to make it reach the level that he was satisfied with when he was so dissatisfied with the fish heart, and the reason why he could not change another creature to achieve his goal. Before this, he had a complete grasp of the cultivation state of the fish heart. He knew what the fish heart lacked at this time, and what he should do to make the fish heart's mind transform and directly achieve the advanced level of cultivation of the mind. Therefore, after deciding to intervene at this time, he did not need to think too much. He only needed to look at the surrounding environment to know which method to choose to give the fish heart enough stimulation to directly make its mind transform. With a slight movement of his mind, the spirit mountain beneath him shook slightly, emitting a force that wrapped around a bit of his mind and rushed up. In the void, it outlined endless complicated and mysterious strange threads, forming unbelievably complicated and mysterious strange symbols that contained endless mysteries, wrapped in billions of rules and laws, and directly rushed into the light and shadow in front of him. That light and shadow were constructed by relying on a mysterious connection formed by the human-faced fish heart's oath to himself. There was a subtle and mysterious connection between it and the will. This connection even surpassed the supreme great Tao of the primordial world, so that it could continue to exist without triggering a violent reaction from the primordial world. At this time, the human-faced Uexian and Taoist who had already left their original lair for a full 10,000 years. They were hundreds of millions of miles away from the intersection of this small world and the primordial world. According to the normal method, it would take years or even decades for one's mind to enter the untainted land from the intersection point, and then to arrive at the place where the human-faced fish and Taoist who were at this moment from the sea area. Not to mention that the two of them would not stay where they were for such a long time. Even if he went there, he would not be able to find them. Just the endless tribulations that he had to endure while walking in the primordial world for years or decades would be enough to completely erase his mind and even affect his body. Therefore, if the human venerable wanted to interfere with the human-faced fish's cultivation, he could only rely on the power of the great Tianyuan world to directly send his mind to the area around the human-faced fish through the mysterious connection between him and the human-faced fish. The infinite symbols formed by the power emitted by the spirit mountain were a kind of great Tao carrier in the great Tianyuan world, similar to the runes, talismans, and patterns of the primordial world. They possessed all kinds of incredible power and could exert the power of the rules, laws, and great Tao of the great Tianyuan world to the extreme. It was with the help of these symbols that the human venerable could make his mind cross layers of space-time and hundreds of millions of miles through the mysterious connection to directly reach the heart of the human-faced fish. Wrapped by the power, the thought flashed and appeared in the position where the light and shadow appeared in front of them. It was within the perception range of the human-faced fish and Taoist who, but it became extremely obscure directly hiding in the invisible and out of their perception. Because of the existence of the power of the great Tianyuan world, the appearance of the mind aroused a more intense reaction in the primordial world than it had been 10,000 years ago. In an instant, a huge tribulation cloud, as black as ink and as thick as hundreds of miles, condensed in the sky. However, although the tribulation cloud was extremely terrifying, it was not very conspicuous in the thunderstorm and lightning in the sea area at this time. The human-faced fish and Taoist who felt at most that the pressure in the void suddenly increased a lot, as if some kind of danger was faintly emerging. Taoist who did not feel much, but the heart of the human-faced fish suddenly felt some kind of extremely familiar feeling in its heart, as if it had felt this kind of pressure and this kind of danger before. Under this subtle sense of familiarity, the eyebrows of the human-faced fish involuntarily wrinkled. After 10,000 years, the human-faced fish had become a handsome young man in his 20s, but no longer looked like a child. With his eyebrows wrinkled, he was full of an indescribable charm of a handsome man. However, this charm of a handsome man had no effect on Taoist who, after seeing the change of his expression, Taoist who also frowned and asked, "Brother Isin, did you find something? I'm not sure, but I seem to have felt this kind of dangerous pressure before. When did it happen?" Isin frowned and said in confusion, "Oh right, I remember now." Just as Ixan finished speaking, his heart suddenly shook, as if a bolt of lightning had flashed across his heart. In that instant, it illuminated his memories, causing him to involuntarily cry out in shock. This shout was like a switch. With its appearance, an extremely fierce change took place. In an instant, the earth shook violently. A huge finger suddenly emerged from the ground where the two of them were standing, crushing towards them with a momentum that seemed to be able to crush everything in its path. To be continued. Baidu Search Bubble Book Reading.